In the main company section, this is indeed where you will find 4 tabs. The 4 tabs being your general tab, your configure tab, defaults, and exports. We're going to start with the general tab. On the general tab, you do have a basic company information. Again, I've just included the Time America company information now. This screen, I always like to say the most important field here is, of course, the name field. I don't know if you noticed or not, but when we logged into the system, or when the login window that you have there, it actually has the company name listed right across the top. Well, that company name is actually being pulled right from this field. Also, in the report section, when you run a report, when that report prints out for you, across the top header, you'll always see the company name. And again, that company name is being pulled from this particular section. The next tab over is the Configure tab. On the Configure tab, these are where you're setting up things that will apply throughout the entire software. For example, the first item here is daylight savings. The company that you're working with, do they observe daylight savings? If so, you definitely need to check the box. Divisions. If the company that you're working with is definitely going to have multiple divisions, then here's where you'll need to check the box. Now, let's define a division. For us, we simply see divisions as a company within a company or subsidiary companies, any location where there may be another company that's all using the same database, but maybe they have a different payroll ID or some type of identifier that separates them for payroll purposes. Therefore, we need to keep them in separate divisions. And do know that employees will not be able to change or transfer into different divisions. So if you have a certain case where, yes, we have 2 companies, but people are actually able to transfer in and out of the 2 companies, well, that's actually going to be one of the labor levels that you want to use, because divisions, you cannot transfer divisions. The labor levels, on the other hand, they are certainly transferable. TA100 Pro does come with 2 labor levels, and we simply label those as department and job. But again, don't get too caught up in what we label those items, because you do have the opportunity to change those labels. So yes, I may have department here, but if you really need to call that location, you can certainly switch the label to location. Breaks and lunch. In the software, you will have an opportunity to build shifts. When you build those shifts, you will have an opportunity to include lunch as a part of the shift, as well as breaks as a part of the shift. If you need to build lunch and breaks as a part of the shift, you do need to activate it here. If you have not activated it here, it will not be available for you to create as a part of the shift. So it's very important, again, when you're having that conversation and you talk about shifts, you want to understand, are we expected to have employees punch for lunch or punch for break? Because if so, and even if they don't punch, even if they say, well, we just want an auto deduction, again, you still need to activate that feature here. Because if you don't activate anything that should take place as it relates to lunches or breaks, you will not be able to do that as a part of the shift section. So use level wage before default assignment wage. Level wage is actually going back to department and jobs. Again, these are what we call labor levels. Some companies actually may pay employees based on a specific job that they are performing. So in other words, if today I come in and maybe I am working in housekeeping, well, maybe the first 3 hours I work in housekeeping. So I have a specific rate of pay that I make in housekeeping. Maybe after I've done my housekeeping duties, maybe I transfer into a different job. Maybe my job at that point, maybe I'm working the front desk. Well, housekeeping as a job pays a specific rate of pay, and front desk as a job pays a specific rate of pay. So that is what we mean by using the level wage before default assignment wage. Now, I will say this just as a reminder. if you have decided to use the level wage, you want to make sure that you are using one level and assigning it to wages. Now, you can still use department and job, but the level, you can only use one wage that is going to be associated, or one level that is associated with a wage. In other words, I'm not going to have departments that have wages, and I'm not going to have jobs that have wages, because then what would happen if you assign someone to a department that had a rate of pay and that person was assigned to a job? Because most people are assigned to a department and a job. Well, the system is then confused, because it's like, well, I don't know which rate of pay I'm supposed to pay if the department has the rate of pay and the job has the rate of pay. Therefore, the software is always going to accept the lowest level. So in an effort not to confuse the system, if you're going to use level wages, it needs to be on one specific level, not on all levels. So if we're going to use it at department, then we use it at department and not job. Or if we're going to use it at job, we use it at job and not department. In my example, it was based on job, meaning the housekeeping job and the front desk job. So of course, my levels or my rates would be assigned to the job. The paid lunches and breaks do not accrue towards overtime. In this window, it's only applicable if the company that you're working with has decided to pay for lunch. If they are not actually paying for lunch, then again, most cases this question is not valid, because most companies that do indeed pay for breaks, meaning they have their employees punch for break, but they still pay for the 10-minute or the 15-minute break, most breaks do indeed accrue towards overtime, meaning they allow that time to still accrue towards overtime. However, it is a rare occasions when people, one, do indeed pay for lunch, meaning they want the employee to punch for lunch, but they are going to pay for the lunch, but maybe they're only paying for 30 minutes. But then the lunch that they're paying for, they could say, well, that time does not accrue towards overtime. Again, some clients do, some clients don't. But if so, you can always activate it from this particular window. The use of SMTP for email. In the security section, we are going to have an opportunity to assign a user, meaning when we build a new user in the software, we will have the opportunity to associate that person to an email address. The purpose for that, in the report section, you are able to email other users reports out of the software. So again, if that's definitely something that you want to do, you would definitely need to activate this particular feature to do so. The login pass-through. The login pass-through is one of a newer feature that we have created in this particular software. It simply allows the user to double-click the TA100 Pro icon, and they're automatically logged in. In other words, they don't have to enter the user ID. They don't have to enter a password. Now, I will say this. For small companies, companies that really just don't have a lot going on, it's just one person in the office, that might be a great thing to do. But certainly if the company is a little larger, there are different managers all using the same machine, then we would never want to do a login pass-through. So I would tell you just be conscious of that when someone is making that decision about how they are regarding security or their environment. Because again, no login means all you have to do is double-click the icon and it takes you right into the software. The tip reporting. If we are going to be requiring employees to enter tips at the clock, we will need to activate this particular feature. Again, remember, this section says anything that I activate here, I'm planning to use later in the software. Same rules apply. You want to use tips, you've got to activate it from this particular window. Wages. If you plan to use wages in the software, again, this is where we would activate that particular feature. Do know the level wages. If you're planning to use level wages, then you definitely have to activate wages. You cannot use the level wages without activating the wages. And again, you can use wages without using level wages, but again, you can't use level wages without using the base wages. The overtime levels. By default, the system actually offers three levels of overtime. Overtime 1, again, is a given, so notice that's not even apparent here. But the question becomes, do you need another level of overtime besides OT1? If so, this is where you would be creating or activating that particular feature. OT1, or should I say OT2, could be defined as double time and a half, whatever you need to define it as. Keep in mind, OT1, most people typically use as time and a half. So again, we know most companies have that first level. But if that company pays anything beyond time and a half, that's where you may need to use overtime level 2 or overtime level 3. Again, not mandatory, but it's all about what that client is using. The use of swipe and go. Keep in mind, the purpose of swipe and go is to make it easier for the employee when they walk up to that clock. In other words, they're just taking their badge, swiping it, and moving on. They're not actually indicating if it is an in punch, if it is an out punch, if it's a lunch punch. They're not making those assignments to that specific punch. If you want employees to make those types of assignments to the punch, then you would certainly need to inactivate or turn off the swipe and go. Swipe and go is saying, I'm going to do that job for you based on the time that the employee clocks in. So the first punch that it sees is typically viewed as the in punch. If that employee has been assigned to a shift that actually has a lunch a part of it, then the next punch that it sees would actually be considered a lunch punch. And again, when they created that shift, they also gave that shift what is called a lunch swipe and go window. So the system is knowing what time it expects that employee back based on that swipe and go max window. If they exceed the window, then it's just going to see it as an out punch and then an in punch. But if they do abide within that particular swipe and go max window, the system will see that as a lunch. So again, it's just all about how we set up the shifts to work with swipe and go, which is why I always say swipe and go is really a three-step process. You can activate it from this particular window, but then we have to take care of it in the shifts if we are going to use it. So we need to do our swipe and go max. And then, of course, in the clock configuration, we have to tell the system which badges are actually going to be considered swipe and go. Now, speaking of clock configurations, there are some clocks that will also allow you to do swipe and go as well as still use the function keys. For example, the majority of our 700 series clocks, we can activate swipe and go, and then I can still say, well, use the function keys or not use the function keys. So again, all of that is a feature. Now, the 500, 600 clocks, once we activate swipe and go, it's just swipe and go. They cannot turn around and still use the function keys with those particular clocks. Below that, the use of AM/PM format. Keep in mind the software in itself is majority of it, well, all of it is in military time. However, there are two sections that we can turn over to be viewed as AM/PM. And those two sections are the time card and your reports. Again, typically the place where the majority of your managers or your supervisors will spend their time. So if they want to be able to view that information in AM/PM format, this is where we can activate that here. But do not use floater for shift selection. Well, right now, if you are not that familiar with TA100 Pro and the way shifts work, a floater right now is not a very, you have no idea what that is. But do know this, when we build a shift group in TA100 Pro, let's say we built a training shift group where the times may start at 7 to 4, 8 to 5, 9 to 6. 3 shifts in that particular training shift group. If I have an employee who is assigned to the training shift group, but we really have no idea on what time they actually start. You know, one day they may start at 7, one day they may start at 8, one day they may start at 9. I can actually assign that person to be a floater in that particular shift group. And again, depending on the time that they clock in, the shift will assign them to either one of those 3 shifts. But that is what we call a floater. Now, there are some companies that say, well, we don't even want to see a floater. All of our employees are assigned to specific shifts, and that's just the way it is. We have no need for a floater. So again, here is where you would simply remove the floater. For us, I'm going to go ahead and keep the floater because I do want you to be able to view the floater. Below that, display print dialog when printing. Again, when you are printing information in the software, or shall I say when you're communicating with the clock, you can actually print the dialog, and that is a part of the clock configuration. When we communicate with the clock, the same way that we can print the error messages there, we can also print the dialog. In other words, what was actually sent out to that clock. Below that, the editable pay periods plus the number of days. I always like to set this at 2, meaning I'm giving the client access to edit the current pay period and to edit the previous pay period. Now, we could certainly give them access to more, but would it be in their best interest? Probably not. If they were to go back, let's say 4 or 5 pay periods and make an edit, well, where is that information going? Remember, the software, or should I say the file has already been loaded into the payroll, and that payroll more than likely has already been done from 4 or 5 periods ago. So if they change it, it's not like that information is going to go anywhere. If you add time to an employee, it's not like that employee is going to be paid for that time because you are addressing something or a cycle that has already been closed for the most part. So again, that's why I say the majority of the time what they need access to is the current pay period and the previous pay period. Because keep in mind, let's say a client just started a new cycle on yesterday. Yesterday was actually the 15th. Well, probably yesterday and today they are wrapping up that previous pay period. They probably did all of their edits and corrections on yesterday, and now today they are ready to create the file to send to the payroll company. So that's why we give them access to that immediate previous pay period, because they're still working it out the first few days of that new pay period. The approval editor, same rules apply. The approval editor is a place that will share with you all of your problem employees, people who are absent, people who have missing punches. That is where you will be able to view that information. The auto logout, you can have the software actually log you out after so many minutes, again, meaning that the system is inactive. So again, here you could set it to 20 minutes or 60 minutes, whatever you prefer. Also, you could have the system log out at a specific time, meaning I know sometimes companies will leave, or some managers will leave, and maybe they left TA100 Pro open. Well, we could, of course, tell the system maybe at 10 o'clock, I need you to go ahead and log everyone off. Again, that is something that the system will do for you. We also have what we call the PC clock settings. In the PC clock settings, if you're going to use the PC clock, you do have some settings that you can certainly associate with it. Meaning, when we configure the PC clock, remember the PC clock is not a physical clock that's mounted, cabled, and plugged in, but it is a simulated clock that actually appears right on the desktop. So we can actually have a few items activated for that. For example, if I were using one monitor and I wanted all of my employees to use the PC clock to be able to clock in and clock out, but that was the only purpose for that monitor, then I may not want to put a close button. See where it says no close button? I may want to make that true because I only want this monitor to be used for that purpose. And especially if the monitor, let's say, is a touch screen monitor, then people could really just walk up to this monitor. I could expand the size of the clock to take up that whole touch screen face. So that's all that the clock is really used for, all that that monitor is actually used for. So you could not close it to get to anything else or any other features. And then at the same time, you could also make it not movable, meaning that this is where it is, this is where it stays. You cannot literally move it. You can also do the speech on the transaction. So when you enter a function or you click a button, it will say clocked in or enter transaction, all of that. The sounds, if you do like to hear the sounds, you can activate the sound, so it'll have the little dings and all of those things after it. And then we could have it closed after transaction is input. But again, if that is the only purpose of the clock, then you may not want to have it closed. So it just depends on literally how they want to set the clock up. But all of those features are available for the PC clock. The INI settings are all different things based on the different features that are available in TA100 Pro. I think it's pretty much on rare occasions do I use the INI programs because it's all custom things that have literally been done for other clients that we just decided to put in an INI file. So if another client needs it, then certainly the feature is here and available. But typically rarely use this with any of my, at least my latest clients. I can tell you I haven't used this. The section below this, the regional settings, the dollar, I've never changed the currency name from dollar, but I assume if the product is being sold elsewhere, certainly that is something that you may change. The date format, right now it is in American format, meaning month, day, then year. The European format would be day, month, and year. The date delimiter, it's just a separator. Right now, notice how it has the slashes, but what if I said I prefer dashes? Again, I can certainly do dashes. So what if I want an asterisk? Or maybe I just want a period. All of that is available. I'll switch it back to a slash. The next tab over is the Defaults tab. On the Defaults tab, this is where you're able to change the labels. Remember I told you earlier, don't get caught up in the label of department or job because your client will actually have the opportunity to change those labels. And here is where those labels are being changed from. So here, if we wanted location to actually, well, if I could get the caps lock off there we are. If we want location to actually say location, again, this is where I can make it happen. So it's no longer department, but it is location. The list items that you see here are all about what your payroll vendor or the payroll vendor that your client is using, what those particular lists are, especially the employee number. And this employee number should always go back to whatever employee number that the client is using for payroll. Prime example, if you're working with, let's say, PayChoice, PayChoice actually uses a 4-digit employee number. So we know here all of the employee numbers are definitely going to be 4 digits. If you're working with maybe ADP, I think ADP used to use either a 3-digit employee number or a 6-digit number. Actually, I think it's 6 digits. So certainly we know that we want to make this 6 digits. So it just depends on the vendor. Also, I didn't talk about the employee label, but your client can change the employee label. Maybe they don't refer to their employees or refer to their employees as employees. Maybe they refer to them as associates. Again, this is where you can relabel employees to then say associates. And then once you have that number or code in place, and that's true for if they're going to be sending departments over and jobs over, we have to make sure that we have the right codes for the department. You know, what are the department codes? Every code or every code has or every department has a code and it has a description. Let's say it's training. It can be training as the description, but the code for that is 123. That's the code for it. We have to make sure that the code also matches up with the length. Is the code a 3-digit code? Is it a 4-digit code? Is it a 6-digit code? And if so, is it numeric or alphanumeric? Because that's the final question here. Even for the employee number, is it numeric or alphanumeric? And just so that we're clear on the difference between numeric or alphanumeric, numeric is saying if we place this at 5 digits and the employee number that you say, maybe the employee number is 99. Well, the software, because you have made that numeric, is actually going to zero field to give you the 5 characters. So 99 is actually going to turn into 00099. because that is a 5-digit number then, because you said it was numeric. On the other hand, if you made that alphanumeric simply says I will accept letters as well as numbers. But if I say it's 99, then it is just that. It is 99. Doesn't have any zeros in front of it or anything like that. So it's not going to zero fill for you. And that's going to be true for the department and the job. Numeric, it will always zero fill. Alphanumeric, it is exactly as you listed. So user-defined fields. In the software, you have an opportunity to create what we call 6 custom fields. What you want to understand about those custom fields is that they are view only. You cannot run reports. You cannot qualify, sort from those items. Again, they are view only. But here is the opportunity where you can create the custom fields. Here I've only created one custom field. But again, the client can use all of them, one of them, 3 of them, whatever they need to use. The badges section. Here is where we're defining from the badge number if those employees are definitely, well, they must always use some type of badge number at the clock. Here, even if they were just pin punching numbers in, well, what number are they pin punching in? But for the badge, if they are using physical badges, you can simply look at the front of that badge, and that badge will always have some type of code on it. Now, if you're purchasing badges directly from us, the badges are 5 digits, which means the length is 5, and of course the max is 5. Now, if they have badges from another company, maybe they have custom badges, we just want to understand what number should we be reading off of the badge, meaning the length, and then what is the total characters on the badge. So that's what we want to understand if they are indeed using custom badges. And are those badges numeric or are those badges alphanumeric? Again, if you're purchasing badges from us, the badges are 5 digits and they are numeric. Now, if you need to purchase badges from us and they must be alphanumeric, certainly we can do that for you. But the base of our badges, 5 digits numeric. The automatic badge assignment. Now, this is one that your clients may be a tad bit confused on because people tend to mix up employee numbers and badge numbers. So again, you want to make sure that they understand the difference. The employee number is typically always coming directly from the payroll software. Remember, that's the lead here, that employee number. The badge number is simply the number that we are assigning based on that physical badge that they are using. So the two numbers are indeed not the same. Now, in some cases, yes, they can be the same. Let's say I have a client that has decided to use a hand punch unit. Well, we know that hand punch units typically don't accept badges unless, of course, they're working with the HP 4000 hand punch unit. But the HP 50, the 1000, 2000, 3000 does not accept a badge. So here, when they go in to actually assign a badge number to that employee, they don't necessarily need a separate number. It could be definitely the employee number. In other words, when that employee goes up to that hand punch unit, what number are they keying into that hand punch unit? We can certainly make that the same as the employee number. We don't need them to be creative and come up with another number. Now, in a lot of cases, companies do. Some companies will say, well, we want that number to be the last 4 of their social. Not a problem. You're just going to keep it at no automatic assignment, meaning that you or the client will be responsible for assigning that badge number. And of course, the length and the max would then change to 4 because you're saying last 4 of the social. The next numeric available is one that I typically try to steer away from, only because if you do not have one person who has the responsibility of adding new employees into the system, the next numeric available is not a good thing. You know, if I have different divisions and there are people at each division that have the responsibility of adding new employees into the software, we can't use next numeric available, because when the software says, well, the next badge number you should be using is this or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I realize I don't have that badge, then there becomes a problem. So again, I recommend the no automatic assignment, or depending on the type of clock that you're using, perhaps the same as employee number. Also, what about the clients that are not using badges? They're using clocks, but they're not using badges. They just want their employees to pin punch in. And they could do that with the 500, the 600, or the 700 series clocks. Again, they could certainly say same as employee number. Why? Because there's not a physical badge in place here. The last tab that we have is, of course, the Exports tab. On the Exports tab, this is where you're able to define the payroll export that the company is going to work with. You'll notice as we scroll the list here, there are quite a few different payroll exports that the software has to offer. So just keep in mind, when you're working with a client and they're discussing what payroll vendor they are using, make sure you double check this list to confirm that it is here. If you do not see the particular export listed here, then I do advise you to call your reseller representative so that they may also confirm. Because what we do have, we have some things that are not, they're kind of semi-custom to a certain extent. Prime example, take a Darwin. You notice Darwin is not listed here. Yes, we do have a Darwin export, but what they will tell you is it is based off of another user's design. So if they can use that Darwin based off of that specific design, then we'll certainly grant you access to it. But again, if they cannot use it, then yes, it may be a custom for your particular customer. Here I'll just go ahead and select, let's say we'll do Prime Pay. Notice once I select the item, it automatically drops to the right side, to the bottom, because I only want my client to see the payroll export that they are going to use. If I want that to be so, all I have to do is just click Display Only This Export, click OK here, and that is a done deal. So now when my client will look at exports, they're not going to see this long list of exports. I don't need them to see all of that. I only need them to see their export that they are going to use. At the bottom, I'll go ahead and click OK here. Take us back to System Setup, or in fact, I'm sorry, before I leave, were there any questions about anything that we discussed here? General, configure, defaults, exports? All right, we'll go ahead and cancel there. Take us back to System Setup, down to Company, and now we're headed to Divisions. In the Divisions area, this is where we can actually create a new division. Divisions, as I explained to you earlier, were different companies within a company, or one company, but maybe they truly had different sites, such as in this particular case, there's an Arizona division, there's a California division, and then we're actually going to add a New York division. So notice how the number, it automatically wants to start with number 3, because the pattern here was where there was a 1, there was a 2, so we're going to start with number 3. Keep in mind, you don't have to start with number 3. I could make this 2525 if I wanted to. So again, the user is always in control of that particular number. But I will go ahead and keep it at number 3, and this is going to be New York. I definitely want this item to be active, because when I need to, I will want to assign employees to this particular item. The address, the city, zip, state, phone number, same information as before from the main company. If you want to include it, definitely you can, but for the most part, you'll never see that information in the software. The field information, you'll notice that there are 3 fields to the bottom right corner. The field information goes back to, remember we said earlier, if they have different payroll identifiers, when we give you 3 fields to actually use for those payroll identifiers. Some payroll vendors have a specific division code that they expect the client to use. Some companies or payroll companies may have what they call a sub-company code. Well, again, we're giving you 3 possible fields, and you can decide what you're going to use those fields as, but I would say be consistent. For example, if we have 3 divisions, Arizona, California, New York, if I decide to use field 1 as a sub-company code, I need to use that across the board. Field 1 in all of my divisions is going to be the sub-company code. Or if I decide to take Field 2 and use that as the division code, it needs to be the division code in all 3 of those divisions. At the bottom, I'll click OK here, and that's how easy it is to add a new division into the software. Now, to the left side, and again, you want to get familiar with this, the configuration here, because going forward, every time you add anything into the software, it is going to continue to use this particular configuration, where anything that you're working with is always going to be to the left side of the screen. You can decide the order, meaning the sort order here, number or name. So if I wanted it in alpha order by the description, I can use name, or if I prefer to keep it in numerical order by the code, I can choose number. So show inactive. Let's say the California division was no more. You know, a few months from now, they've decided to close that particular division. Well, I can actually go in, uncheck, or actually I said California, didn't I? So let me highlight California, click Edit there. I can uncheck the active box for California, click OK here, and notice it has a little asterisk by because I have checked the box that says Show Inactive. But if I don't want to see my inactive divisions, I can simply uncheck the box, and I only see the 2 active divisions. So again, you can inactivate items that are no longer in use. The goal is you don't want to delete it, because if you delete it, you're going to delete all of the history that is assigned to it. In other words, you wouldn't be able to go back and say, well, show me reports that were using that particular division, because you've deleted that division. So typically, I never recommend deleting divisions or department or job, labor levels. Even employees, I never recommend deleting that, because when you do, you're deleting everything that was attached to them, especially the employees. You delete an employee, well, you just lost all of the history that was attached to that employee. If you do need to bring it back, so let's say we need to make the California division active again, I'll just bring or check the box to show that inactive item, highlight it, click Edit, check the box here, click OK, and that item is now back to being active. All right? So it's very easy to do. Also, you have an expand window here. Here, if maybe my descriptions were a little long and I needed more room, I could certainly use the expand feature. But everything seems to fit quite well here. Any questions about the configure of divisions? At the bottom, we'll click Close here, back to System Setup, and now we're headed down to Categories. And remember exactly what categories are in the system. Categories are nothing more than all the possible types or buckets of time that can be paid out to an employee. That's what you're looking at here. So again, you'll notice to the left side, the system does give you several defaults that it has created for you. So all of those are available. What we're going to do is actually walk you through adding a new category. Because believe it or not, categories are very important to the software. Why? It is the category that essentially you are exporting out to the payroll vendor. In other words, you're saying, well, Tracy Aikens had so many work hours. Tracy Aikens had so many holiday hours. Tracy Aikens had so many sick hours or vacation hours. It's literally those hours or anything in a dollar amount, such as tips or what have you. Those items are going across. So not only are you creating the category, but you're also assigning the export code to it in this particular section. And remember, the export code is what allows that information to go across into the payroll software. I generally like to define your export codes as basically the bridge, because if we do not have the correct export codes, that information is not going to go across into your payroll software. At the bottom here, I'll go ahead and click Add. The item that I'm going to create is actually going to be bonus. Now, equals category number from hand reader. In the hand reader, we do have the opportunity to allow employees to walk up to a hand reader and input a certain category entry. So if I wanted them to input bonus, I could assign a number to bonus. Maybe bonus is number 5, in that window when they walk up to it. Well, I could make that so here. Well, the truth of the matter is, would you really want the employee to add a bonus at the clock for themselves? Probably not. So again, I'm not going to assign a number to that as a hand reader. The name itself, I'm going to go ahead and key that in, but I also keyed it in as an uppercase item, so it will blend with the other items. Now the code by default is always uppercase, so I did not have to do anything special there. It's just as soon as you key it in, it does accept it in uppercase. But because all of my other descriptions or names were also in uppercase, I did decide to keep the name in uppercase as well. Active, yes, we definitely want this item to be active because we want to be able to use this item. And then right next door to that, do you wish to export this category? Well, definitely we wish to export this category. Again, if I want the employee to be paid for this item, definitely I want to export it. Or in some cases, even if you don't want them to be paid, but you want the information to be tracked, again, you may certainly want to make sure that the payroll vendor knows that it's not a paid item. Because most clients that want to track items will simply mark it as a non-paid item here, but they won't export it. So if you do export it as a non-paid item, certainly make sure that the payroll vendor is aware of it. And now for the next section, it says hours or dollars. Hours or dollars, simple question. In other words, when we pay out bonus, is it something that's going to be paid out in hours, or is it indeed going to be paid out in dollars? Of course, we know bonus is typically paid out in dollars. It's just a flat dollar amount. But for the fun of it today, we're going to pretend it is paid out in hours. When I pay this item out in hours, and remember, this could be any item that you are creating, there are questions that you need to answer. One, the miscellaneous entry overrides absent. What I'm saying here is when I pay out this category, do I want it to automatically override a day where an employee may be absent? So say Tuesday today, this employee failed to clock in, failed to clock out, so they automatically came across as absent. If I went in to pay them a bonus day of 8 hours, do I want the bonus day of 8 hours to override that absence? If so, you want to check the box here. Now again, it just depends. Some clients say yes, some clients say no. For example, maybe vacation overrides an absence, but maybe sick doesn't override an absence. So again, it just depends. The next question here, miscellaneous entry overrides holiday minimum hours. Well, we have not arrived in the policy section where we truly discuss the holiday minimum sections and things like that. But the question here goes back to that policy and what we could have set up. If in that policy we told the system that employees must work the scheduled day before the holiday, the scheduled day after the holiday, and on the scheduled day before and after the holiday, they must work at least 6 hours. Well, the question is, if that employee doesn't work the scheduled day before and or the scheduled day after, but maybe one of those days is a bonus day, where maybe I paid that employee, again, 8 hours of bonus time. Do I want that bonus time to count as this minimum for that holiday requirement? If so, you can check the box here. If not, in other words, if that employee took a bonus day the day before or the day after the holiday and they should not receive the holiday, then you do not want to check this box. So again, it just depends on the rules that are being set in place. And then the bonus itself, is it something that is paid or is it something that is just being tracked? A big difference, because we don't have to pay every category that we build. Some categories are strictly for tracking purposes. Notice there was even one here. Here it is, sick, non-paid. Maybe that employee doesn't have any more sick time, but they are indeed sick. So we're going to classify it or label it as sick, non-paid, but they're not going to be paid for it. So same rules apply. Every category that you build, you decide if it is a paid entry. Now, if it is going to be paid, there's a follow-up question to it. And notice it was not activated until we check the box for this to be paid. Can this category be overtime? In other words, can it ever be paid at an overtime rate? Now, the question isn't, does it accrue towards overtime? That's in a completely separate place. This is, can this category, anytime you pay this category, would you ever pay the bonus at a time and a half rate immediately? If so, you can check the box, and it will allow you, whenever you pay that category out, you will find that a window or a field will be open just to the right that says, okay, how should I be paid out? Regular, OT1, OT2, whichever overtime features that you've activated, and you can decide how you're going to pay it out at that time. And the last item here, post-to-benefit entitlement. Remember, in the software, we have one benefit entitlement that just comes with the software, meaning you're going to activate that, and the client will be responsible for updating the balances in those particular windows. Or we also have something that is called benefit accruals, where you give us your particular rules on how the time actually accrues, and we will go ahead and handle that. You know, oh, the first 5 years they only get 40 hours, and then after the 5 years it bumps up to 80. Again, you give us all of those rules, and we'll put those into the system for you. So that's called benefit accruals. If they're definitely going to use benefit entitlement or even benefit accruals, you do want to activate or check this particular box here. Now, bonus, of course, is not something that would typically accrue time or is considered a benefit, so I don't need to activate that feature here. But if we were talking, let's say, personal time, vacation time, we definitely want, or sick time, or PTO, we definitely want to check that particular feature here, especially if they're using benefit accruals, and if the client plans on just entering the balances for them as benefit entitlements, they can do that as well. Any questions about the General tab here? Well, when we head over to the second tab, and remember, we're looking at this from an hours perspective, you'll find that there is a grid. In this grid, the best way that I can tell you to do this is think about this first row that's labeled None. Remove that None label and replace that with whatever category that you are building. So if we're building the category of bonus, then this None turns into bonus. So the question becomes, when I get ready to export bonus as a regular hours, what export code am I going to use? If bonus is something that can be paid as an overtime item, what export code am I going to use for OT1, as well as if it can be paid at OT2, what export code am I going to use? This is the main row of concern. Now, the D1, D2, D3 rows, those rows are all about differentials. In TA100 Pro, it does give you the opportunity to create 3 differentials. So here, if we're saying bonus can ever be paid as a differential, then again, we would need the export code for bonus to be paid at a differential. If it can be paid at multiple differentials, that's why you have D2 and D3. And you still need export codes if it is paid out at an overtime rate or an OT2 rate as a differential. You'll need to input those as well. Now, keep in mind, bonus typically isn't something that would more than likely be paid at a differential rate. On the other hand, if you take work time is most definitely going to be paid at a differential rate if the client is using differentials. Because most clients say it's typically only work time that will be paid as a differential. Now, granted, I do have a few clients that say, well, if that is a second shift client who always works second shift, and if they take vacation, they can get their differential rate when they take vacation. So again, you need to make sure that you put in the differential export codes for vacation or sick or personal, things like that. But again, the payroll company should know that, and they should give you the proper export codes. Now, the code that you see just hanging off to the right by itself, it's called the field code. Currently, there is only one company that I know of that actually uses a field code, and that company is ADP. The way ADP does your exports or their exports is they will literally take all of the time. So let's say vacation, sick, bonus, personal, family illness, bereavement, jury duty. They take all of the time and drop it into one bucket. So here, let's say they may have the code of 24. So everybody has that same code, though. Vacation has that code, bonus has that code, jury duty has the code, everybody has the same code. But the field code, because once they take it and they drop all of that time in bucket 24, it is then separated by the field code. So here, if I'm working with bonus, bonus may have a code of B, a field code of B. Or if I was working with vacation, vacation may have a field code of the letter V. Or if I were working with sick, sick may have a field code of S. So it just depends on, again, the payroll vendor in question. But ADP right now is the only company that I know that still uses the field code for this particular example. Right. Remember, I did not use ADP. I did use, I think, Prime Pay. Here, if you go back and if I just uncheck these and I switch this truly to a dollars item, which it is, if we go back to export codes, you'll notice here I only need to be concerned with one export code. Why? It's a dollar item. A dollar item is not paid at overtime. It doesn't do differential. It doesn't do any of that. I just need to pay it at that flat dollar rate.
Hello?
I'll make the code 19, and I'm all done with that. At the bottom, I'll click OK, and we have successfully added a new category of bonus. Questions, comments, or concerns about that new category? All right. At the bottom, we'll go ahead and click Close here. Go back to System Setup, and now we're down to Policies. In the Policy section, remember the purpose of a policy. The purpose of a policy is where we begin to look at all of the different types of employees that are actually in the software. So here I have two policies already created, Standard and California. I'm actually going to walk you through adding a new policy. Are you guys still there?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we are here.
Okay, because I noticed there was a question. Can anyone, hello?
Yep,
Ryan?
okay, I can hear you now. It was silent
Okay.
for about 2 minutes.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, I can hear you now, though. Hello?
Let's see. All right.
Hello?
Then, if everyone can successfully hear me, we are moving on.
Okay,
We are actually going to, hello?
Yeah, almost, it keeps going in and out. Hello?
And when you say it keeps going in and out, is it just I'm stopping talking for a moment? Is that what you're hearing, or?
Like it's your phone goes completely silent. I just hear hissing.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not having that problem. I hear you fine, and it's never cut off.
All right. Maybe I'll dial back in.
All right, Ryan, try that.
Hello?
Are you working with a headset or something, Ryan? Okay. At the bottom, I am going to go ahead and click Add because we are we're going to look at the standard policy first before we add a policy. So let's do that first. So I'll click Edit to the bottom. So notice the code is completely grayed out simply because I was already working or making an edit to this code. So when we make an edit to something, You can never change the actual code. The code is basically already in place. I can change the description if I need to, but definitely not the code. Active, remember, this is a new or this is a policy that's already in place. We definitely want to keep it as active because we can go back and make a policy inactive at any time. The pay period section. In the pay period area, this is where we're determining the pay cycle of this particular policy. So that's one main item that separates or causes you to have to create multiple policies. Some companies may have some employees that are paid weekly. Some companies may have employees that are paid monthly, bi-weekly and semi-monthly as well. So again, it means you're ending up with all of those different policies. Again, this is a big item as it relates to pay policies. One, if they're definitely going to go weekly, you want to make sure that the start date that you choose here is always the first of the month, based on the first being whatever day their overtime cycle runs. So if a client says, well, we are paid weekly, but our cycles run, let's say, the Tuesday through Wednesday. Well, guess what? I'm looking for a Tuesday that actually starts on the first of the month. Now, why the first of the month? Because I'm guaranteed that every month has a first. In other words, I would never try to use the 31st of the month. Well, every month doesn't have a 31st, so it's just always good to go with the first. Again, I'm using that based on the overtime cycle. So if the client said our overtime cycle is Tuesday through Wednesday, again, I'm trying to find a first that starts on a Tuesday to take care of the overtime cycle. The biweekly is the one that's a little tricky here, because remember, a biweekly cycle could be an odd or it could be an even cycle. Current date today right now is actually November 16th. So that means, according to this pay cycle, it's a pay cycle that started on November 7th, and it actually ends on November 20th. Now, I'm going to try to find another Sunday here that may potentially yield another first. Up still the same date. So let me find another one. It's got to be one. Let's go back in time. And this is why I do keep all of the little calendars that you have. We'll use March. Oh, still same cycle. Let's use November. There we go. So notice, even though I was still using the first that fell on a Sunday, it wasn't until I used November 1st of 2009 that actually changed the pay cycle. Notice the pay cycle is no longer, I think it was the 20th or something, but here it is now November 14th to November 27th. So all of those completely changes what that pay cycle is, which is why, and I'll go back and just reverse it for a moment here, August 1st of 2010. Notice it's the 7th through the 20th versus the 14th through the 27th. So you want to make sure when you're working with your client, that's why any client that's always on a biweekly cycle, I want to know right then what is your current pay cycle that you are in right at this time. And that's what you want to know. Because when they tell you what their current pay cycle is at that time, then you know which day or which one of those dates that you'll need to use. Because you're going to have to, again, just play with it until you get the right first of the month that yields that particular cycle for that client. So again, notice I had to go through quite a few Sundays that started on the 1st until I got to one that gave me that cycle of the 14th through the 27th. So again, it happens. It certainly can happen that way. The punch defaults, the ignore, or let me go back. I didn't finish the semi-monthly. With semi-monthly, again, you just have to tell the system what's the stable cycle in a semi-monthly cycle or a semi-monthly pay period. For us here at Time America, because we do semi-monthly. We have the 1st through the 15th, and then we have the 16th through the end of the month. Of course, the stable time frame is going to be the 1st through the 15th. So that is where you're going to decide the number of days in a semi-monthly period, the one that is definitely the most stable. Now, remember, all clients don't actually go the 1st through the 15th or the 16th through the end of the month. I do have some clients that will go the 5th through the 20th and then the 21st to the 4th of the month. Again, it's all doable. Remember, same rules apply, which is the stable time frame in that particular or in one of those pay cycles. And the stable is always going to be the 5th through the 20th, because the 21st to the 4th, although they're definitely dates, but some months, again, may have 31 days. Some months may have 30 days. So I can't actually say how many days are included in the 21st through the 4th, because that is a changeable number. But my stable time frame is definitely going to be the 5th through the 20th. The monthly cycle. When you're focused on a monthly, most clients do indeed focus on monthly, but again, meaning starting the 1st of the month. But again, there are some clients that actually say, well, you know, we do monthly, but we actually start the 3rd of every month. So again, same rules apply. If they're going to start on the 3rd, not a problem. But what we want to know is what is the actual pay cycle or overtime cycle. Because if they say they start on the 3rd, but let's say their pay cycle for overtime purposes, they view overtime as Wednesday through Tuesday. That means now I'm looking for a Wednesday that starts on the 3rd, because I have to make sure that those dates are correct, because they're not using the 1st, they are using the 3rd. So that is one occasion where I'm no longer looking at the 1st, but I'm truly trying to find a Wednesday that falls on the 3rd of the month, so I can make sure I have their overtime cycles correct, as well as I have their start dates correct as well. The bottom section, the punch defaults, the duplicate and the opposing. The duplicate punches the 2 minutes, meaning if an employee is indeed using a physical clock, if they walk up to that clock and they clock in, then maybe they turn around, they start chit-chatting, and they clock in again. If both of those punches are within 2 minutes, then guess what? The software is only going to share one of those items. It is not going to share both of those. That's the beauty of the ignore duplicate punch. The same with the opposing punch. Maybe an employee clocks out, and then that employee clocks back in. Again, the system is essentially going to ignore both of those, because if that out punch and in punch were within 2 minutes, because it literally appears as though the employee never clocked out in the first place. You can certainly increase the minutes here or decrease the minutes here. It just depends. The missing out punch limit. 12 is never a great number for this particular occasion. I always represent or recommend you want to take that to 18, meaning 18 is a fairly large number that we typically don't ever expect employees to work beyond in one day. Now, 12 hours is easy to do because some companies do have employees that work a double shift. Well, we all know a double shift is at least about 16 hours, so that's already over the 12-hour mark. But even if they work a double shift, I'm pretty safe here with my 18 hours. The default work totals, again, if we wanted to have an employee where they clocked in but failed to clock out, and we wanted to tell the system to go ahead and pay them a lump sum of time, such as 8 hours, we could do that here, and that is what we call a default total. Now, I'm not a fan of a default total, only because if no one goes back and corrects that missing punch, that employee may be paid for 8 hours when essentially they only worked about 2 hours. The maximum out punch link back to the next in punch. Again, this is one of the cases where you have a customer that has multiple shifts in a day. Maybe they have some people that work maybe the morning shift. Somebody comes in at 6 a.m. and they work till 9 a.m. They leave, and then they come back, and they work from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. Well, there is a gap there from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. of about 6 hours. If I want both of those shifts to link together, then I need to tell the system that there is indeed a link back time. Now, when is that most important? Because essentially, there's one rule that makes this question not even, for the most part, valid, and that is daily overtime. If the company that you're working with is definitely doing daily overtime, then this question is a valid question, because we want to make sure that the two shifts link together for the purpose of daily overtime. Otherwise, if the company doesn't actually pay daily overtime, this question is not at all valid. The boxes that you see here, the first change punch accrues to previous in punch. In other words, if we have employees that are transferring, let's say, jobs, well, maybe employee comes to work and we have a meeting, and at that meeting everyone is told what job they're going to work on. The meeting is no more than about 15 minutes. So people come in the morning, they clock in, they go right to the meeting. We have our meeting, the meeting is over, they go back to the clock, and they transfer into the job that they have been assigned to. Well, I can tell the system those first 15 minutes, go ahead and take those first 15 minutes and also assign that to that first change that they do at the clock. So if they were scheduled to start work at 7 o'clock, they did. They came in at 7. We had our meeting from 7 to 7:15. At 7:15, they went back to do that change. That's the first change because they're transferring into that job. I can tell it to take the information from the previous in punch and also assign it to that job as well. The reset swipe and go at midnight. If the company is indeed using swipe and go, then we definitely want to reset swipe and go. Because remember how swipe and go works. It's based on the first punch that it sees in that particular day. So if I want to make sure, let's say Joe Sample did not clock out today. Well, if I want to make sure tomorrow when Joe Sample comes to work that in punch is not viewed as an out punch for the day before, then I need to reset the swipe and go at midnight. Now, on the other hand, if you're working with a client that has decided to use swipe and go, but they do indeed have employees that work across midnight, then again, you don't want to reset swipe and go. Because what's going to happen is for an employee that clocks in at 10 p.m., and meaning that's their first punch of the day, if we reset the swipe and go at midnight, when that employee got ready to clock out at 7 a.m., that 7 a.m. punch is going to be viewed as an in punch and not an out punch. So again, if you have employees that are working across midnight, I would not recommend the use of swipe and go. The next tab over is the Holidays tab. On the Holidays tab, we have to start with the eligibility side. In other words, if we're going to pay holiday, so that's really the first question here, does the policy pay holiday? You'll find that it's checked off here. So if this policy does indeed pay for holiday, I need to confirm if the employee is going to be eligible to receive it. Have they been with the company at least 45 days or 60 days or 90 days, whatever time limit that company has put in place? Are they required to work the day before and the day after, or is it just one or the other, the day before or the day after? Or none at all, none of that, meaning they're not required to work the day before or the day after. You can do either one of these. Also, when we do before and after or before or after, I can also set the minimum number of hours. Remember we talked about that earlier in the category section. That's where I was saying, does bonus override those minimum work hours? And this is where we're seeing where we can create what those minimum work hours are. So the day before and the day after, if I want to make that 8 hours, the day before and the day after, here's where I would do it. Meaning that if this employee is supposed to be paid the holiday, well, they have to abide by these rules. As long as they've been with the company 90 days, and the scheduled day before the holiday, they worked 8 hours, and their scheduled day after the holiday, they worked 8 hours, then they would actually receive the holiday pay. Now the question is, well, what is the holiday pay? Well, that's the holiday parameters. The first question, apply the holiday when not scheduled to work. If the employee should always receive holiday, whether they work on the holiday or scheduled to work on the holiday or not scheduled to work on the holiday, then you want to check this box. Great example of that. Let's take some cases where some employees are always off on Sunday and Monday. Those are their 2 days to be off. They work Tuesday through Saturday. So Sunday and Monday, they're always off. The question becomes, well, most holidays typically fall on a Monday. Would this employee get the holidays on a Monday, such as Labor Day, Memorial Day? Would they get those Monday holidays? If so, you definitely want to check this box. The holiday hours can accrue towards overtime. Again, what's the company policy? Some companies will allow it, some companies will not. It just depends on the company policy. The hours to add for each worked holiday. So if an employee meets the qualification and we just want to pay them the holiday, how much time are we going to pay them? Now this is when they do come in and physically work on the holiday, because there are some companies that are open on the holiday. So what happens? If that employee comes in, let's say they work 3 hours. In addition to that employee working the 3 hours, are we also going to give them 8 hours of holiday pay? That's what this is saying. So you came in, you worked 3 hours, we're still going to give you your 8 hours of holiday pay. Now, some companies would do something different. They would say, well, we'll pay you holiday pay, but it's actually based on the actual hours that you worked. So remember, we said that the employee worked, 3 hours. So here, if I said the employee worked 3 hours and I did a 1-to-1 ratio, because it says multiply worked holiday hours to apply to HOL, and I'm using a factor of 1. So you work 3 hours. I'm going to pay you a factor of 1 for every hour that you work. So that's 3 hours. You work 3 hours, I'm going to give you 3 hours of holiday. Or I could actually say, well, make it 1.5. So if you work 3 hours, I'm going to multiply that times 1.5, and of course the employee would end up with actual work hours of 3, but they'd end up with 4.5 hours of holiday hours. So again, it depends. Some companies even say, well, we make it 2. You came in to work for 3 hours, we're going to pay you for 6 holiday hours. So it just depends on how they want to pay that out. For the unworked, so again, the employee that did not physically work on the holiday, we're going to just pay them 8 hours of holiday pay. Now, the given minimums and the given maximum items that you can have here kind of go back to this particular rule here. You know, let's say we kept it at the 1. So the employee actually came in, but they only ended up working 3 hours. Still, if I want to make sure that that employee got their 8 hours, I could put 8 here. So the system knows we'll go ahead and give them the extra 5 hours because they definitely need a minimum of 8 hours. And the maximum, well, maybe you had an employee that came in and worked on the holiday and worked for 10 hours. Well, are we saying we still want to give them 10 hours of holiday? Well, maybe we only want to give them 9 hours. That's the max. Or maybe the person worked 12 hours and we said the max was 10 hours. Again, you can set a maximum as well. The beginning pay rate if the holiday is worked. Again, this is another way that they could do it. Maybe they're not paying it at a ratio, a 1-to-1 ratio or anything like that. They're just saying if the employee comes in and works on the holiday, we're going to have all of that time be paid at OT1. And that's a very popular one. If you work on the holiday, those hours are paid at overtime. They don't give you anything in addition to that. So these rules up top do not apply. It's just if you work on the holiday, the hours are paid at time and a half. Or some cases, they could be paid at double time. Now, what about this? Maybe some of the holidays that you work are paid at time and a half, and then some of the holidays, because they're special holidays, are actually paid at double time. That's the purpose of this question. Beginning pay rate if holiday worked is using a secondary rate. So maybe Christmas, maybe Thanksgiving, maybe New Year's, all of those days are actually receiving double overtime. The reset at end of the day, typically you do want to reset at the end of the day, but that also depends on if it is a customer that has employees that work across midnight. That's one that you'll need to have a chat about with the company. Any questions about the holiday options? We're headed into overtime. Overtime does start with an overtime cycle where you have to define what the overtime cycle is. Of course, the most common overtime cycle is, of course, a weekly overtime cycle, meaning any hours more than 40 actually use a multiplier of time and a half. But that's not the only overtime cycle. Believe it or not, there are some people that do a biweekly overtime cycle. You'll find that a lot in the medical field, people working in hospitals and things like that. They do a biweekly overtime cycle. So they may have 80 hours. Because what may happen is one week they may have an employee that works 50 hours, but then the next week that employee may only work 30 hours. So it just depends, and that's why they have a biweekly cycle. Semi-monthly, haven't seen a lot of those, but they do indeed happen, and haven't seen a lot of the monthly, but again, they do indeed happen. Here we'll have this set at 40 with time and a half. The OT2, notice the period limit here is set at what we call an infinity, the 999999, because no one in 1 week would ever work 9,000 hours, 999. It's no way. So here, we're just saying we're using that as a holding spot because that multiplier of 2, defining the definition for OT2, is definitely being used. Well, remember, I could have used it over here as a part of the holiday. If you work one of those special holidays, you get OT2. So we had to define OT2 someplace. Well, this is where we define it. The daily overtime. Well, take a look at Sunday. In this rule, they're saying that Sunday is actually receiving double time. So again, that's the reason why we had to define what OT2 represents. Anytime an employee comes in to work on Sunday, it's automatically set at double time. Monday through Friday, it's all regular time, but if that employee works more than 8 hours on Monday through Friday, anything more than 8 hours drops as OT1. And you could even take it a step further. If they work more than 12 hours Monday through Friday, that drops as OT2. All that is a possibility. And then on Saturday, it starts at OT1, meaning anytime they come in and work on Saturday, they're automatically going to be paid at time and a half. The reset at day end, again, I typically always recommend checking this box unless, again, you have that situation where the employees work across midnight. Because for us, when we say day end literally means midnight. The consecutive days, now this is another option of overtime. Consecutive days meaning, well, if the employee works 6 consecutive days, I can actually tell the system what to do on that 7th day. So here's where I'll determine the number of days, 6 consecutive days. And on all 6 of those days, I could also tell the system, well, they have to work a minimum of 4 hours. If they work a minimum of 4 hours, I can also set a total. So out of the 6 days, they at least needed to work, let's say 40 hours. So if they met the minimum every day and they ended up working more than 40 hours in the 6 days, I could say on the 7th day, they're automatically at OT1. Now, in addition to that, we could say what happens on the 7th day. So this box, notice it says on days that qualify. So here's where we're talking about, in our example, the 7th day itself. If that employee comes in on the 7th day and they work more than 4 hours, I could tell the software to make anything beyond that double time on the day that actually qualifies. Now, in my example, that concludes my weekly overtime cycle. But if you're wondering why you have these other two rows, remember there are other overtime cycles that could have been used. Let's say the client was working with a biweekly cycle or a semi-monthly or monthly. They may have this set at, let's say 15. They may have this one set at 21. So all of those are a possibility. Okay. The reset at overtime cycle in, I would always recommend doing the overtime cycle in. That means that if I had this set at weekly, again, it's going to start off that process all over for the week. It's not just going to keep going and saying, well, everything after that is overtime. No, no, no. We're resetting this overtime cycle at the end. The next tab over is the differential. Remember, I did explain to you earlier that there were 3 differentials that you could create or assign out. A differential is something that could be paid as something extra. So again, my example is always the shift work. 7 to 3, that's the basic shift. You get nothing extra. Well, 3 to 11, maybe if you work 3 to 11, you get an extra $1 an hour. So if you typically make $10, if you work 3 to 11, you get $11. If you work 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., it's hard to get people to work those particular shifts. Well, maybe those people actually get an extra, $3. Again, if you typically get $10, you're now getting $13 when you work that particular shift. Now, my example was an addition. It was an addition of time. I said addition of $1, and then I think I had another one addition of $3. So again, both additions. On the other hand, you could have a multiplier. Again, there are some companies that do multipliers, meaning that if that employee typically makes $10 and we decide to give them maybe 25% of that $10, then that's actually going to be, what, $2.50. I could do that as well. So let me put those back there. And here we'll make that 25. So that could be a multiplier. So I'm saying 25% of $10. So you're actually, whatever you're making, you're getting 25% of that. So that indeed is going to be an extra $2.50. All of those things are indeed possible. Okay. The differential fixed to the end. In this case, go back to my example, the employee who works 7 to 3. Well, maybe today that employee had to stay longer. They were not done doing whatever they needed to do, so that employee did not leave until 5 p.m. Well, the question is, should that employee get the differential from 3 to 5? And that all depends on how you answer this question. If the differential is indeed fixed to the end, when this employee clocked in, it was 7 o'clock. There is no differential attached to the 7 o'clock. If you don't check the box, as soon as that employee moves over into the 3 o'clock hour and they are still working, if the differential kicks in at 3 o'clock, they would indeed get the differential for those first 2 hours from 3 to 5. So it's just all about how you answer this particular question. Any questions about differential? And the last tab here is the exceptions tab. In the exceptions tab, this is where you have the opportunity to build any possible exception that you need for an employee or for a policy. Remember, I always like to say exceptions. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just all about what your company would like to see. Think of these as custom reports that your client is building for their viewing pleasure. They can define consecutive hours, meaning there's going to be a report that says, show me anyone who has consecutive hours. Well, that number is going to be based on whatever number you told the system here. So now they're saying, well, show me that consecutive hours report for anyone who works more than 10 hours, because that's the number that you define here. In most cases, people will want to run those reports, but they will not understand where the information for that report is based from. And it is all based in the exceptions that you have decided to choose here. All right. Any questions about the exceptions area? At the bottom, I'll go ahead and cancel. And then we are going to actually add a new policy. So I'll click Add here, and I'll copy it from the policy that we just discussed, Policy 1. But this indeed is going to be Policy 3. I'll go ahead and label this Standard No Holiday. Say yes here. And I'll make a few changes. I'd like that to be 18. We know there's no holiday pay. The overtime looks good. Differential, exceptions, all good. All right. Right now, I do find that it's the perfect time for our first break of the day. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Right now, it is about 9:33. 10 minutes would actually make it 10:43 my time. So I'm not saying to disconnect from the go-to meeting. We're not doing any of that. I'm simply just going to put you guys on hold. I ask that you put me on hold. And in exactly 10 minutes, well, 9:44, I will be back on the phone. Thank you so much. Hello?
Hello.
All right. I want to check in with Ryan. Ryan, are you back with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Did we solve or did you solve your problem?
I'm actually not sure what was going on before. I think it might have been an issue with GoToMeeting. I called in, I think, 2 or 3 times, and it finally worked on the 3rd try.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Interesting. All right, then before we get going, are there any other questions, comments, concerns about anything that we discussed? A lot of information happening there, company, categories, policies, just within, what, an hour and a half, 90 minutes. All right, then we are free to move forward. We're actually heading into the shifts section. Remember, shifts are nothing more than the schedules that are going to be assigned, or shifts meaning start and stop times, that are going to be assigned to the employees. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, we have clients that don't actually use shifts, because that's going to be the first thing that they'll tell you. Well, our clients don't, we don't have our employees assigned to specific schedules. The one got you about TA100 Pro is that for the most part, shifts are somewhat mandatory. Now the question is, well, what makes them mandatory? And I'll give you the 3 items. 1, if they're going to do any type of rounding rules are created as a part of the shift. In other words, you don't create a rounding rule and assign it directly to an employee. You create the rounding rule and it's assigned to the shift, and then the shift is assigned to the employee. So again, rounding rules. The second item, I mentioned it earlier. If there are going to be any type of lunch characteristics that are assigned to a shift, or break characteristics. So if you're expecting that employee to punch for lunch or punch for break, and you need the lunch or the break to be paid, or you want to do auto deductions, again, that is a shift configuration. All of that happens in the shift. So you do it in the shift, and then you assign the shift to the employee. And the last item is the shift differential. If the client that you're working with is definitely going to be using differentials, well, differentials, meaning when they kick in, the start time and the stop time of a differential, that is all a part of a shift. So those 3 things make shifts mandatory. Now, if you have a client, they're not using differentials, they're not using any type of rounding rules, everything is actual time, they're not having employees punch for lunch or punch for break, again, you don't have to worry about using shifts. But if you want to do any of those extra things, then again, shifts are indeed mandatory. What we're going to look at creating for you today is actually a new shift group. You'll see to the left side that there are 4 shift groups created. There's the union shift group, the non-union, days, and flex. We are essentially going to create one new shift group. So to the bottom, we'll click Add here. I'll go ahead and label this shift group 300. We'll go ahead and call it the training shift group. It is going to be active. We definitely want to be able to use this. It is not a flex or open shift group. And speaking of a flex or open, what if you have a client that says, well, we'd like to use the rounding rules, or we'd like to use the auto lunch deductions, but we don't actually have any specific start or stop times that we want to assign to our employees. Well, that is indeed what we call a flex or open shift, meaning we're just creating a shift, a make-believe shift. It really has no specific start time, no specific stop time, but it is something that we can assign rounding rules to something that we can assign shift rules to, such as if they punch for lunch or auto deductions for lunch. It just gives us something to add those rules to. So again, that is also a possibility. This shift group, of course, is not going to be a flex or open. It is going to be a shift group with specific times. Now, to the bottom of the screen, this is where you'll find the rounding. So even before we build the shifts itself, we are talking about the rounding. You'll find by default there's always at least one predefined rounding rule in place. I'm going to just pick on the standard rounding here for a minute, because if I select standard rounding, I also have the opportunity to edit this particular item. Right now, the standard rounding is actually catering to the nearest 15 minutes based on a 7/8 split. So essentially, the first 7 minutes go back to the previous quarter, 8 or more go to the next quarter. But what if you wanted to do something more specific? Prime example, in the start column here, the round, grace, and dock. Those are the three magical questions. If you look at the graph or the diagram here where you have the 8 a.m., think of that as the official start time. The round that I'm controlling is from this point, see the green arrow pointing to the start time? I'm saying if that employee should clock in early to send it to the scheduled start time. Well, the question begins, well, how many minutes are we considering to be early? Well, I could tell the system, make it 30 minutes. So by adding my 30 minutes here, it assigns a time here. So you'll know exactly what window of time is going to 8 o'clock. So that's why I say if you use 8 o'clock as the start time, I'm literally telling the system anytime an employee clocks in from 7:30 to 8 or between that time, all of the time rounds to 8 o'clock. So if they clocked in at 7:47, it's going to 8 o'clock. If they clocked in at 7:35, it's going to 8 o'clock. The grace. Notice the blue grace, and here's where we have that line. It's going back to 8 o'clock. So if that employee should happen to come in late a few minutes, how many minutes do we send back to 8 o'clock? Here I could tell the system to do 5. In other words, any time from 8:01 to 8:05 is all going back to 8 o'clock. Now the dock is a very serious item. Notice the red item equals the dock here. So if I put in actually 15, I'm saying any time that is greater than 8:06 is then going to move forward to 8:15. That's essentially what I'm telling the system to do. 8:06 or greater is then rounded to 8:15. So we're actually docking those employees. So if that person actually clocked in at 8:07 thinking they were going to get credit for 8 o'clock, they are sadly mistaken. They are going to be docked for at least the next 8 minutes because it's all going to 8:15. So those are very specific rounding rules. Now the question becomes, I have controlled what's going to happen from 7:30 a.m. to 8:15 a.m. Again, about about a 45-minute window around the 8 a.m. time frame. So the question is, well, what happens if an employee comes in before 7:30? Or what happens if an employee comes in after 8:15? Well, that is what we refer to your outside rounding rules to handle. The outside rounding rules will take care of that for us. Outside rounding rules say if an employee clocks in before 7:30, I can send it to 0, 3 minutes, 6 minutes, 15, 30, or 60. And then, of course, you can control the split. For example, the 15 actually has a 7/8 split. You could put a split on the 6 minutes. You could put a split on the 3 minutes. Well, 0, probably no split there because 0 literally means actual time. You could also do 30 minutes and you could put a split there. You could make that 15. Or you have 60, you could do a 30-minute split there. So it just depends on what the client wants to do. Here, we'll go ahead and keep it at 15 with a 7/8 employee comes in before 7:30, the time will round to the nearest quarter based on a 7/8 split. So all of that was for the start time. The stop time, basically the same three questions: a dock, a grace, and a round. Assuming 1700 or 5 p.m. is the stop time, I could do a dock of 15 minutes, again, if someone tried to clock out early. A grace, I could do a grace of 5 minutes. Again, if you do clock out early, as long as it's within the 5-minute window, I'll give you credit for it. And then a round, I could do a 30-minute round. Almost, well, basically the reverse of what we did here. We kept the round 30 minutes, we kept the dock 15 minutes, and the grace of 5 minutes. So the question then becomes, because I've only controlled another 45-minute window around 5 p.m. So the question becomes, if an employee clocks out before 4:45, where does the time round? And if an employee clocks out after 5:30, where does the time round? Again, we have to go to our outside rounding rules, and right now it is currently catering to the nearest quarter with the 7/8 split. But just because you have the start doing that, you could have your stop doing something completely different. That's why you have one side outside for start and one set of outside rounding rules for the stop. All right, so all of that is a possibility. Here I'm just going to cancel it, which means I'm going to leave it at just the base of the quarter round with the 7/8 split. So all of that is just going to be outside. It's just going to go here by default because I haven't answered any of these particular questions. For the lunch, go ahead and look at the standard rounding rule for lunch. Right now it is setting lunch at a 60-minute duration. Notice it says total duration is for 60 minutes. It has a minimum total duration time that overrides any deduction. And here it's set at 5. Now what's the purpose of that question? Well, one, because the question right below it said round short duration forward to total duration. In some cases, people have an issue with employees taking lunch and maybe not taking the full duration for lunch, such as the full 60 minutes or the full 30 minutes for lunch. Well, here we're telling the system, as long as that employee clocks out and they're gone for at least 5 minutes, if they're gone more than 5 minutes, we're taking the full duration. Now, if they were gone less than 5 minutes, we would not take the full duration. But if they're gone 6 minutes or more, we're taking the full duration. That's what round short duration forward to total duration. So again, if an employee is scheduled for a 60-minute lunch and that employee clocks out and clocks back in and they've only been away for 17 minutes, I am taking the full 60 minutes. The grace, you could have a grace time here. This grace is currently set for 2 minutes, but you could increase it or decrease it or not have it at all. But again, we're saying essentially we're giving that employee 1 hour and 2 minutes to get back and only have or be deducted for that hour. The outside rounding rule, well, what happens if that employee is gone longer than the extra 2 minutes? Again, we can tell the system exactly what to do here. We could, of course, round it to the nearest 15 minutes, or we could keep it at 0, which means actual time. So it just goes back to what the customer really wants to do here. Now go ahead and cancel and keep that particular rule. For the break, if we click the drop down here, break works exactly the way the lunch did. It's all about a duration. You pick the total duration, which in this case they have set for 15 minutes. They are doing a round short duration, which is if the employee has gone longer than 6 minutes or more, they are indeed going to take the full 15. There is no grace. The outside rounding rule, they do indeed have that set to the nearest 15 minutes with the 7/8 split. And in this example, I'm definitely not going to use a break, so I'll keep that as an undefined. but I wanted you to actually see how the break does appear. To the bottom, I'll go ahead and click OK here. And now to the right side, I'm actually going to add a new shift. In other words, we've created the shift group. Basically, we've created a label that's called training for a shift group. But we essentially have not added any shifts into that shift group just yet. That's what we're going to do now. So to the right side, we'll click Add here. The shift number, I'll go ahead and label this as Shift 1. I'm going to start this shift at 6 a.m. The cutoff. The cutoff is something I mentioned earlier today when we talked about shifts and floaters, because the cutoff is determining if someone is going to have a floater, what makes that floater then go to the next shift, or how is that person then assigned to the next shift. Here, I'm saying as long as this employee has clocked in by 6:30, that they can be assigned to this particular shift. This is going to be a shift that starts at 6 a.m. and ends at 3 p.m., which is 1500. Notice this is all in military time. Even if we had activated the AM/PM, it would not have affected this particular area. Remember that AM/PM activation only applies to your time card section and to your report section. Does not apply to the shift section. The process on the in or the out, again, this is where we're processing the information. In most cases, this does not affect anything unless we're creating a shift that crosses midnight, because that becomes a serious question. If we're creating a shift that started at 10 p.m. and the shift ends at 7 a.m., well, what day should all of those hours go to? Should they go to the in punch day, or should they actually go to the out punch day? And that's where you would need to answer this particular question. But in our case, 6 a.m. and 3 p.m. both fall on the same day, so we can just keep it to the end. And now for the lunch setup. In the lunch area, this is, and break is exactly the same. If I told you earlier, break and lunch handle exactly the same. This is where I'm going to activate what I want this particular shift to do as it relates to lunch. Well, I'm going to do two things. One, I am going to give the employee the responsibility of punching for lunch, but I'm also going to do an elapsed deduct. In the event they forget to punch for lunch, I want the system to make sure that it does the auto deduction for them. The lunch swipe and go, and this is what I told you earlier. If we were definitely using or activating the swipe and go, we would need to activate what is called a swipe and go max in the software. And this is the section where we activate that swipe and go max. And right now, because I am going to set the lunch to be 1 hour, I'm going to set the swipe and go max to be 1 hour and 15 minutes. Now, granted, I'm not saying this employee can be gone 1 hour and 15 minutes. What I am saying is most people typically do stay a little longer than the hour, or even sometimes a little less. So we've handled a little less in our rounding rules, but I still want this to be labeled as a lunch. So I'm saying as long as they are back within 1 hour and 15 minutes, it will still be labeled as a lunch when I look at the time card. Now, if they are gone more than 1 hour and 15 minutes, it's just going to be an out and an in punch. The break, I'm not going to activate a break in this particular example, but again, notice it works the same way. I can have them punch, or I could also do an auto deduction, and I would still need to do a break swipe and go max as well. Now, in the exceptions area, this is a nice feature because it allows you to actually create exceptions reports. What if I said, show me any employee that clocks in after, let's say 6:01 to 6:30. Anyone who clocks in between that time. So literally, I'm trying to see anyone who's actually late. If they're clocking in at 6:01, that means that they were late. And then in addition to that, I could also tell the software, show me any employee. Oh, what did I do there? Go back for that. Let me just fix that. 6:30, 1500, there we are. Punch, elapsed, 6:15. And then here I think I did 6:01 to 6:30 on the in punch. And then I want to come here, and we're just going to do 14:30 to 14:59, and that's going to be an out punch. So any employee who actually tries to leave early, starting at 2:30 up to 2:59, if they clock out, I want to know about that as well. So I can actually create an exceptions report that will give me those particular entries. Now, the bottom part of the window, this is where we have to create the lunch deduction. So this is all about our lunch rules. So for none, we'll click the drop down. We'll click lunch because, again, I did say I needed to control what would happen with lunch. Is lunch going to be paid? No, it is not paid. The elapsed deduct? Definitely, because I did say if the employee did not punch, I wanted to deduct the lunch. In the elapsed, I'm going to make this after 6 hours. So again, as long as the employee works more than 6 hours, well, let's be clear about that. Where does the 6-hour mark start from? Do I have it starting from the shift or the actual punch? Again, some clients will do the shift, some clients will do the punch. For training today, I'll do the actual punch. And then we're going to tell it to deduct 1 hour. The duration for lunch is also 1 hour. And it is not paid, or I'm not paying anything outside of that hour, because if the lunch was paid, let's say I had decided to pay for an hour, here's where I'm deciding on what that punch duration for lunch is. Am I going to pay anything outside of that? And then if so, how much time am I going to pay outside of that? Again, not going to activate that particular feature. At the bottom, all I have to do here is click OK. And I have added the first shift in the training shift group. Well, let's go ahead and add another one because we at least want to add 3 there in total. So this is going to be a breeze. When I go to add the next shift, it automatically copies the information from the previous shift or whichever shift I had highlighted. And because the 6 o'clock was the only shift there, it automatically picked this information up from that shift. So here I can take this 002, make that 7, make that 7:30. That's going to be 1600. I'm going to go here, make that 7, make that 5:15, make that 7. And then everything else stays just as it is. The lunch keeps the same rules. At the bottom, I can click OK. And that's how easy it is to add a new shift into the shift group. I can also highlight shift number 2 that I recently added, click Add again, and I'm ready to move on to the third and final shift. So that's going to be 8:30. It's going to be 1700. The exceptions, going to make that 8:01, 8:30, 16:30, 16:59. And all of our lunch items tend to stay the same. Perfect. And that is our training shift group. Now, within this shift group, if we had differentials, remember there's the last tab, it's the differential tab. If we were going to assign a differential to this particular shift group, I could say anyone who works from 5 a.m. to 10 a.m. on Sunday and Saturday. Maybe it's just hard to get people to work those morning shifts on Sunday and Saturday morning. I can click OK here, and it populates that information just to the left side. So still in my training shift group, the differential has now been associated with it. And remember that differential 1, 2, 3, that also depends on the policy that someone has been assigned to. So you need to be clear about that as well. Any questions about the shift group called training that we have created? All right. The flex, remember I mentioned earlier, the flex actually contains no start and stop time. It's just a shift that we've created so that we could assign some rounding rules to, or we could dictate what we're going to do with lunch, such as an auto deduction here. But again, it does not contain a specific start and stop time. So a shift group called flex is great when a client is saying, well, yeah, we want to do rounding, but people don't have shifts. And that means, one, they can do rounding, but they're going to all do outside rounding, such as rounding to the nearest 3 minutes, 6 minutes, 15, 30, or 60. They won't be able to do what we were showing you earlier, the 30-minute round or 5-minute grace, because they don't have a specific start and stop time to cater that to. So if they don't have a specific start or stop time to cater it to, there's no way that we could do a round or a grace or a dock. All right? Any questions about shifts at all? All right, at the bottom, we'll go ahead and click Close there. Still working under System Setup, we're now headed down to the Holiday section. In the Holiday area, remember back in the policy, when we created the policy, there were some policies, not the last policy that we created because we did specifically say no holiday, but there were some policies that did indeed pay out the holiday. Well, the question becomes, well, which holidays does the system know to pay out? It knows to pay out whatever holidays you have included in this section. Now, another follow-up question to that, what you'll need to communicate with your clients, well, do all of the employees at the site receive the same set of holidays? In other words, there could be some employees that receive 10 holidays, some employees that receive 6 holidays. That's one option. Or something else that could happen, you could have some employees that get all of their holidays Monday through Friday, and you could have some employees that only get their holidays on the exact holiday itself. We do give you the opportunity to accommodate for that because you can build 4 shift groups. So that's what these are, 4 holiday groups. That's what these groups are here. Now, caveat here is you cannot label them. So the user would need to remember where Group 1 represents all of my Monday through Friday people, or Group 2 represents all of my 24/7 employees. So they would have to remember what those group numbers represent, Group 1 versus Group 2. So at the bottom, let's go ahead and add a holiday. We'll add Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving this year actually falls on November 25th. We'll go ahead and make that Thanksgiving. It is going to be active because I want to make sure this holiday is paid out. Override absence allowed. Whenever I pay out this holiday, if an employee was absent, I'm going to override that absent by literally paying out the holiday. So again, the employee failed to clock in, failed to clock out. We know they're going to come across as being absent. Well, when the holiday pays out, it's actually going to override the absent label. So you will not be able to see the holiday and absent. You're only going to see the holiday. Now, some of your clients may certainly want to see the absent label as well. Therefore, you do not have to override it. Apply the work time in this holiday to a secondary overtime rate. Remember, back in the policy when we're talking about holiday, and I said, well, some holidays could be paid at double time versus your basic holidays are paid at time and a half. Well, if I am going to make Thanksgiving a secondary holiday rate, all I have to do is check the box here. And whatever secondary rate we applied back in the policy would then be catering to this particular holiday. Again, I'm not making Thanksgiving a secondary holiday rate. But to the bottom, I am going to go ahead and place this in Group 1 as well as Group 2. Group 1, I think I labeled the Monday through Friday group. Group 2 is my 24/7 group. At the bottom, I'll click OK. And now when I go to add again, let's say Christmas this year, Christmas is actually going to fall literally on the 25th, which happens to be a Saturday. So we'll say Christmas, active and override. It does indeed receive a secondary overtime rate. But remember, only one of my groups is actually going to get it on the 25th, and that's going to be Group 2. Group 2 being my 24/7 employees. So I click OK there. Then I'd add it in again, this time focusing on the 24th. And we'll do the secondary overtime rate. This time I'm going to apply it to Group 1, not Group 2. Group 1 is my Monday through Friday employees, and click OK here. So that's how that would all break down. You can create up to 4 groups if you need to. Now remember, all companies don't necessarily work like that. Some companies say, well, the entire company is going to observe it on Friday. Again, I only use this as an example, but you have to square that away with the particular client that you're working with. Any questions about the holiday configuration? Oh, just something else to add into this window. You will also find some clients will say, well, oh, we have a floating holiday that we've had. Well, you know, every employee gets their birthday off. Remember, if the floating holiday is not going to be applied on the same day for everyone at the company, then you don't want to add that holiday here. The holidays that you add here are going to be paid out to everyone. You know, for example, the whole birthday. Well, we don't want to put everybody's birthday as a holiday here because everybody's going to get that day off for everybody's birthday. That's going to be a personal instance where I say, okay, give that employee 8 hours of holiday on their birthday, but not listed here as a part of the holiday. The holidays that are listed here are the holidays that are paid to all of our employees. Any questions about the holiday section? All right, at the bottom, I'll go ahead and close there. Take us back to system setup, and now we're coming down to groups. In the group section, think of this area as a part of our security. So let me tell you the purpose of the groups. In security, you have to define a new user, and then when you create that new user, you're going to give that user 2 types of, or you're going to assign that user to 2 pieces. One piece is going to be to decide what type of access that employee has, meaning what they can do in the software, meaning if they have access to run reports or access to making edits in the time card. In other words, what features they can see and do in the software. And then the second part of that is, well, what employees are they going to have access to? That is security. Well, when it comes to deciding which employees are going to have access to, that part of security is what we call groups as well as divisions. You can take those divisions and make that a part of security as well. Prime example, some companies, or in fact some time and attendance companies will say, well, we do that based on departments. We do not. Departments for us are completely separate from security. Let's say I have a department of customer service that's 250 employees, and I have 6 managers to manage all 250 employees. Well, each manager should not have access to all 250 employees just because that's how many employees are a part of customer service, the department. Each manager has their own set of employees to manage. This allows us to separate those sections off. So while, yes, I may have 6 managers in customer service, they're each going to be responsible for a separate group of employees. So that's the purpose of our group. It allows us to just filter down a little bit smaller than just the department. Now, granted, in some cases, yes, I do have some companies that will use their departments as their groups. Basically, we're just mirroring whatever we created as their departments. We're mirroring that in the group section. That is definitely not a problem. So what I like to start clients with in this section is I'll give them 2 scenarios, and they have to decide which scenario best fits their environment. So scenario number 1 I typically give them is it's going to be the main user, maybe a backup person with access to the software, but those are the only people that will need access to the system because they're going to do all of the edits and corrections for all of the employees. That's scenario number 1. Scenario number 2 is going to be the main user, a backup person, And in addition to them, there are going to be managers or supervisors that will have access to the software. But the managers and the supervisors will not be able to view all employees. They'll only be able to view their specific group of employees. And again, depending on if they said scenario number 1, we don't need to create groups. But if they said scenario number 2 best describes their environment, this is where we're creating the groups. Here you'll find that there are 4 groups already created. I'm simply going to add a 5th group here, and I'm going to call it training. Well, I guess if I had my fingers on the keyboard, right? And it is going to be active, and it's just that simple. Now remember, eventually in training session 2, we will certainly go and show you how to assign those particular or that particular group to the employees. Because in the detail screen, when you add a new employee into the system, that is one of the things that you'll need to assign is the group assignment. I'll go ahead and close here. Or any questions before I close? Because I think right now groups may be a little gray for you or a little fuzzy for you, but I promise you when we do get into the security side, you will see the groups come alive there. It'll all come full circle for you. Go ahead and close there. Take us back to system setup. And now we're coming down to department. In the department section to the left side of the screen, this is where you'll see a list of all of the departments. Again, not necessarily looking exactly the same as our groups, but kind of somewhat similar. Departments, or in this case, well, we relabeled them locations, so you'll clearly see it says location. Remember, if I close here, go back to System Setup, Company, Main Company, over to my Defaults tab, I can just relabel that department and click OK. Go back to System Setup and then down to Department, and it actually now says Department versus Location. So remember, I told you it's all about a label change. It's what your client expects to see. I'm going to add a new department here, so we click Add to the bottom. I'm going to label it as Department number 5. The name on it, of course, is Training. Active, definitely. We want to make sure that we can assign this. The use of an hourly wage. Well, this goes back to the level wages. So if we're going to assign level wages to departments, again, this is where I can check the box, and notice it opens up the hourly wage field. Now, I can put an hourly wage here. So let's say anytime you work in the training department, you're going to make $15 an hour. But if I want to change this or manipulate this on an individual basis, I'm also going to show you how you can do that in the employee section on tomorrow. Because maybe there are some employees that make more than $15. Maybe there are some employees that make less than $15. You can do that on a specific employee basis, which is why in most cases I don't actually recommend putting an amount here, because I normally like to take care of it on an employee-specific basis if the employees definitely don't make the same amount. Now, if it is an environment, for example, hospitality. Hospitality is big on if you are a server. I don't care how long you've been with the company, all servers make $2.50 an hour. That's just flat across the board. Then certainly I'll go ahead and keep it as a part of the hourly wage listed here. Now, the budgeted total hours or the budgeted total dollars, these are great features for your clients where they're actually able to create the actual versus the budgeted report. But that means they have to include the budgeted information. Well, this is where they are creating the budgeted piece of information. As long as they have included the budgeted piece of information, they will be able to run those actual versus budgeted reports. Now, here's the caveat, though. When they create a budgeted amount or budgeted hours, they need to remember what time frame that amount is covering. So if I decided to put in a budgeted amount for a month, well, when I run that report, I need to make sure that report covers a month. That's what you have to make sure of. Okay. At the bottom, I'll go ahead and click OK. And just like magic, there is a new department to the left side of the screen. Any questions about the department? I'll go ahead and close there. I'll take us back to system setup and then down to job. Now the great news is the screen looks exactly the same as department. So once you understand how to configure one labor level, you certainly understand how to configure the remaining. And speaking of labor levels, I don't think I mentioned this earlier. If you're working with a client and they have decided that they need more than the 2 basic labor levels, well, that means you may need to bump them up to Genesis Pro or Genesis SQL. Because with Gen Pro, Gen SQL, you get the 2 basic labor levels, department and job, but you're also able to add what we call job costing, which would give you task, operations, and step. It would give you those extra 3 labor levels. So in total, you could have up to 5 labor levels if you went with that particular product. So just keep that in mind. If they need more than 2, they will need to be bumped up to Gen Pro. You cannot add the job costing module on to TA100 Pro or TA100 Lite. Here I'll click Add, and we'll go ahead and code this as 1. We'll make this TA100 Pro. Remember, it is going to be active, but I'm not going to set an hourly wage because I've already activated an hourly wage to be used with the department level. So I wouldn't set an hourly wage to be used with the job level because that's going to confuse the system. And not so much confuse it, but more so it probably confuse the client because remember, if that employee is going to be assigned to a department, then they're going to be assigned to the job, the system is going to look at the lowest level to use that particular wage. I'll click OK there, and that's how easy it is to add a job. We'll go ahead and add 1 more. And click OK there. Perfect. Any questions about departments or jobs or what we consider to be labor levels in the software? All right. We'll go back to system setup, and now we're coming down to Bell schedules. Now, Bell schedules is actually one of the first items that is viewed as an extra module, meaning this isn't a standard feature that comes with TA100 Pro. A standard feature, meaning anything else that we've talked about here, such as the labor levels. But Bell schedules is something extra that has to be purchased. Now remember, you're not purchasing the bill from us. What you are purchasing from us is actually the relay module. That's essentially what you're purchasing from us, is indeed just the relay module. But once you have the relay module, you will need to configure what we call bell schedules because you will have to assign the bell schedule to a specific clock. So the clock is going to tell that relay, hey, it's time for that bell to ring, and the relay is going to communicate with the bell to say, please sound. There can only be 1 bell schedule assigned to 1 clock, so keep in mind if you're working with a client and they only have 1 clock, you want to make sure that you understand that 1 clock would need to encompass all possible bell times. So if they have 3 different shifts, well, you need to make sure that you put all 3 of those shifts in this 1 bell schedule because they only have 1 clock, and you can only assign 1 bell schedule to a clock. At the bottom, I'll click Add here. I'll code this as 1, and I'll label it Standard. I'll click Add just right to the center, and this is where we can add a bell schedule. I'm going to make this bell sound on Monday through Friday. The first time that I'm going to choose is going to be 8 a.m. The duration, I want it to last for 3 seconds. Click OK here. I'll click Add again. Still Monday through Friday, and no, there is no shortcut or redo or copy for this particular feature. I'll also make that the 12 o'clock item last for 3 seconds. And I'll go Monday through Friday again, and this will be for 1 p.m. or 1300. That will also last for 3 seconds. And we'll do one final item, still Monday through Friday. This will be at 5 p.m. or 1700, 3 seconds. If I need to make a change to any of these items, maybe the 8 a.m., maybe I want that the beginning of the day, I want that to sound longer than 3 seconds. I can switch that over to 5. And as soon as I tab out of the duration field, notice this duration is automatically going to update. Automatically switches to 5. If the 5 p.m., again, I need that to also represent 5 seconds. Notice as soon as I tab out, it automatically updates it for you. I can click OK, and that bell schedule has now been created. In just a moment, as we go into the clock configuration, we will show you how to assign it at that time. Any questions about creating a bell schedule? Perfect. We'll go ahead and close here. And now we're headed into another extra module. I spoke of it earlier. We're talking about benefits. I explained to you then that the system comes with what we call benefit entitlements, basically a place for your client to put in their information manually, meaning they can go in every month, every week, every year, whatever it is, and issue that information. Or if they want us to do that, then they just need to give us the rules, and we would do that in your benefit accruals. Well, that's the feature that we're going to look at today, is the benefit accruals. If you notice, benefit accruals is not a part of system setup. However, it is a part of daily operations. It's one of the last items here. So we'll come all the way over to daily operations, down to benefit accruals, and over to configure, because they do need to be configured. You will find that there is already one benefit module created, so we'll just have a closer look at that item. So to the bottom, I'll click Edit here. What you're viewing, if you just look to the right side where it says Categories to Sum, essentially there are 2 types of benefits that you can create in the system. One is based on hours worked, meaning every hour that an employee works, time is being accrued for vacation, sick, personal, PTO, whatever they accrue time for. Or it could be done on time passed, meaning every year this employee gets 40 hours. Again, that's time passed, where I'm just paying them a lump sum. And the time it doesn't have to be every year. It could be every month. Every month I'm giving you 8 hours. But again, it's just called time passed. So those are the 2 types of benefits that the software pays out. They're based on hours worked or time passed. So key is hours worked, time passed. If they're going to be using hours worked, then to the right side, the categories to sum, the system wants to know, well, what should I be tracking to pay out the time? When it says based on hours worked, meaning is it based on any category that is applied to the employee, or is it just on work time? Is it work time, vacation, personal time? Which items am I looking at that anytime an employee is paid for those items that we need to calculate? And that can become quite interesting, because you have to take into consideration, well, if you give the employee vacation time to use, are you also not incorporating that as a part of the benefit to be paid back to them? Because at the end of the year, you expect the employee to work 2080 or 2,080 hours. Well, all of that time is not going to be physical work time. It is going to be, some portion of it may be vacation, some portions of it definitely are going to be holiday. So all of those things should then contribute to how the time is accrued to the employee. Now, that's me saying that, but again, a company certainly may have a different outlook. So that's why you have to communicate with the company what categories are they allowing the time to be accrued from. Definitely makes a big difference. But this is where you would select those categories. So if they said only work time, then again, you would say work time. Now, when you did define what the categories are, you then also have to determine, is it just regular hours? Could it be overtime hours? And keep in mind, it's definitely going to be the regular hours, but the overtime is the big question. Now, what people tend not to realize is that If we say that it also includes overtime, it's not as though the employee is going to get more time than someone else. It simply means that if you take an employee who works more overtime than another employee, maybe you have one employee that never works overtime, and maybe you have another employee who is always working overtime. It simply means that the person who is always working overtime is certainly going to accrue their hours much faster than the person who doesn't work overtime. But if we set the max to be, well, regardless, you can never accrue any more than 80 hours, they both would end up with 80 hours, just one person may get there a little bit faster than the other. And that's because you have allowed the overtime to also work towards the categories to some. So that's what this whole right side is about. Now, to the center here, this is where we are building what categories or what benefits this policy is going to control. Here you'll find that they have created personal time, sick time, and vacation. Personal is something that accrues on an annual basis based off of the hire date. It looks like sick time is something that accrues on an annual basis, but it is not based off of the hire date. It is a January 1st date. So that means every January 1st, it looks like people get a lump sum of time. And vacation, employees, vacation is paid on a monthly cycle. So again, not on an annual cycle. It does appear to be paid on a monthly cycle. So every month, this employee would get a time or several hours of vacation. Well, let's have a closer look at it. We'll use the personal time. Click Edit here, and you'll notice it brings up the accumulator window. In the accumulator window, because we are in edit mode, personal time is already selected, so it is grayed out. The posting basis, as I told you earlier, because we could see that from the initial window, it was based on annual, but it could have been weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, or daily. It could have been any one of those items. Again, they simply went with annual. Now, when they decided to go with annually, across the way, they had to find a reference date. Remember, I think it was the sick time was actually going to use other because they decided to go with January 1st. But for personal time as well as for the vacation time, they did choose the hire date. You could have also had an option to choose fiscal as well, meaning that in every employee's detail screen, there is a field that determines their hire date, and there is also a field where you can define a fiscal date for each of those employees. If you wanted the benefit to accrue based on that fiscal date, this is where you could have made that happen. But again, here we did choose hire date. And the other, again, like the January 1st date they choose, this is where you could have applied that, or if we wanted July 1st, we could have certainly chose that date as well. But again, we are going to keep it at the hire date. The start date, well, what is the activation of this particular policy? Now, typically, I always like to go back to January 1st of 1900 because my goal is to make sure that I have covered the oldest employees that actually may be working at that particular company. But let's say the company hasn't always done personal time. Maybe that is indeed a new benefit for them. So they may have a true date, a start date for that particular benefit. The gift, and I do refer to this as a gift. I know they say give here, but it is a gift. I'm saying I'm going to give this employee something up front. Let's say I wanted to give this employee 8 hours. As long as they stay with the company after the first 3 months, they'll get 8 hours of personal time. And again, some people certainly do that. They don't give you any time up front, but they will decide to give you 3 hours, or 8 hours after 3 months. Because essentially what we're saying here, when you look at how this is written, personal time will be issued to this employee after they have been with the company for a year. They're not going to get any time up front. So if we want to give them any time up front, either we change this beginning where it says one time where they'll get it immediately because it is based on the hire date, or I can wait until they've been with the company 6 months and maybe I could give them 20 hours, but that is how it would have to be handled. if we click the details here, because this will give us more insight, notice it starts with 00. Well, that is the beginning. Notice it says straight given hours at. Well, that's going to be on an annual basis. So the annual is the next time after it has gone through that annual cycle, they're going to get the 40 hours. If I wanted to give them 40 hours up front, that is a one-time given. That's how they would get the time up front. But right now, this employee, let's say someone who hired, May 5th of 2010, they would not see those 40 hours until May 10th of 2011. That's when they would see that time. The from or hours from categories to some, well, that was the first type of time that I shared with you earlier. This is where you'd have to put in a factor. So every hour that you work, what is going to be the factor of time that we're going to pay you for that hour? Again, some companies, it could be, 0.00145, or whatever it is that it may take to get them to 40 hours. Again, assuming that they are accounting for all possible time. Then again, that could definitely be what they would need to do. Right? The minimum hours needed. So in most cases, when companies do categories to some, they will put in a minimum number of hours. So if this employee wants to get that 0.0145, they would indeed need to work at least 35 hours. Now, let me also say this. In most cases, when a company does categories to some, it's typically based off of a weekly cycle, not so much an annual cycle. So again, if it's based off an annual cycle, certainly that is a little different than 35 hours. We may be expecting them to work more like 2,000 hours or something like that. But an annual is certainly a little bit harder to keep a minimum item connected to. But the maximum hours allowed. So this is also what I was referring to when we talk about the person who works the overtime versus the person who doesn't work the overtime. If we have already set the max to be at 40, well, I don't care how much time overtime they work, they're still not going to accrue any hours more than 40 because we can set that particular max here. The maximum annual carryover, is there any carryover? A lot of companies these days are removing carryovers. Even here at Time America, we used to be able to carry over all of our hours. Now we only get to carry over 24 of those hours. The maximum total benefit hours. The maximum total benefit hours all go back to, again, that employee could have had time before you started using this system. Well, now, since clients or companies are really cutting back on, holding that much time on the books, because again, to a company, 40 hours of vacation equals a dollar amount in somebody's budget line someplace. So they're trying to remove all of those extra dollars per se. So they're not allowing people to carry over as much time as they have in the past or have all of that information. But let's say they started with a new system. Some people still have several hundred hours of time. So maybe they have said, you know what, you can only have 200 hours. That's the total. That's the life of this benefit going forward. And essentially what that means is when, at the end of the year, when this cycle is ready to roll forward, if they are not allowed to carry over anything, then they're always just going to have that 2 hours. Nothing else will ever be added to this. Now, if they were, in addition to this, allowed to carry over the 40 hours, and let's say they didn't have 200 in their overall balance, then they could certainly keep adding to this until they got to the 200. But even at that point, even if they were accruing time, the system would never even allow them to accrue any more than 200 hours. So at any given point in time, the system would not allow this person to be over 200 hours because that is the total benefit that they can ever have in this particular benefit type. Again, all of those are possible things that you can do. I'm just going to remove all of this. but all of those are possible things. I do want to take a look at the vacation because the vacation used a monthly posting basis. And yet they also had stages. So remember I said, well, at the beginning you don't get anything. But again, this is a month. So that first month, of course, the employee isn't going to get anything initially. But at the end of that first month, so let's say they were hired May 5th. Well, come June 5th, they will get that first 6.666 hours. But then after that, notice there's a change. There's a year change to 3. There's a year change at year 5. And notice there is an increase. So this is where we can build those stages in advance for you. The client doesn't have to come back in and change the rules. You told us that up front, so we know how to handle that. And remember, since everything happens at the end of the cycle, remember year 3, the end of year 3 is really the start of year 4. So keep that in mind. When the employee rolls into their 4th year, they'll then get the 10 hours. Or when the employee completes their 5th year, because everything happens at the end. So at the end of the 5th year, starting the 6th year, they're going to move up to the 13.333 that they will get every hour, or excuse me, every month. Because again, this is a monthly cycle basis, but it still is rolling or changing how much it's issuing out based on an annual cycle. Any questions about that particular example? All right, I'll go ahead and cancel there. Any questions at all about benefit accruals? There's a great thing about the benefit accruals. If you build it, you can always go back and test it. And I'll share that with you in training session number 2. Because anything that we build, we can always go and assign it to just a demo employee. We can backdate the hire date. So if we need to make sure that this is going to do what it's supposed to do after 5 years, that's no problem. All we have to do is backdate it and assign it, and we'll be able to go and see every time all of those benefits were paid out. All right, I'll go ahead and cancel here and close here. So that concludes the 2 modules or the extra pieces that are a part of TA100 Pro, those extra things that you must purchase. The next item that we're going into is clock configuration. Now, under clock configuration, which is a part of communications and then down to configure, you'll find that there are several clocks here. For today's training session, our focus is indeed going to be on the 500, the 600, the 700 clocks, and the hand readers. But the good news is the 500, 600 clocks, as well as the PC clock, they all follow the same screen. So the 500, 600, the screens are primarily the same, just as all of the 700 series clocks. Again, all of those clocks are essentially using the same screen. I'm going to start here in the TA500, though. We'll click Edit here. And again, because there was already a clock listed, notice the code is already in place, the label or the description of the clock. Now, in the description, I typically like to input exactly where that clock is located. So if I have a client and they have 3 clocks, one of the clocks is at the front door, back door, warehouse, then that's how I like to label the clock so that when they go to communicate with those clocks, they can actually see exactly where those clocks are located. The communication, because remember, that's the whole purpose of the clock setup or configuration here. We have to define how we are expecting to communicate with this clock. In other words, you have a clock that's hanging on the wall. How are we going to get the in punches and the out punches from that particular clock? All of that is a part of the communication. You'll find here you can have a direct connect, which means there is a cable running from the computer directly to that physical clock. You can have the LAN. Again, that's going to be the first section here. You need to fill out the baud rate, the LAN ID, and if it is a converter in place, is it an RTS or SD, ready to send or send data. If it is a modem clock, in the bottom right corner, you'll need to fill out that information. Most importantly, though, I must tell you, is the phone number. People tend to forget, depending on the environment they are connected to, what that clock needs or wherever we're calling from, what do we need to call and communicate to that clock. For example, here at Time America, if we're calling out, I know I need to put an 8 in front of that number because that's the dial out number. So I just need to make sure the number that I'm putting there contains the 8, the 1, the 9, whatever you need to do to get to that particular phone to make it communicate. The start and stop answer windows, I must tell you I'm not a fan of start and stop answer windows because what most people don't realize is a start and stop answer window is literally controlling when that clock will be available for us to communicate. And if we tell the system that, let's say, the clock is only able to communicate from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m., well, guess what? If I'm not at work between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., I'll never be able to physically or manually communicate with that clock because it's only going to poll at that time of the day. So apparently I must have an auto polling already created that is going to take care of that because I won't be able to poll it any other time. The ring delay, depending on if they are going to that clock is sharing a phone line with something, they may have a ring delay that they want to put in place. The last item there, it is the number of retries. So again, depending on which method that you're using to communicate, they certainly may want to put at least 2 retries there, or at least 1 retry, shall I say. Ethernet, don't think I talked about that one. So again, if we are going to use Ethernet, we definitely need to have the IP address in place. And of course, the IP port needs to be in place as well. Also in the communication area, the COM port. So what COM port is that particular communication device using directly from that computer? Has to be connected to something. And of course, the serial baud. For most cases, the 500 series clock, 500, 600 is always set at 9600. The miscellaneous section. Depending on where the company or the clock is located, there certainly could be a time difference between the computer and the clock. All of that is a possibility. So here, you'll notice it goes in negative numbers as well as positive numbers. Keep in mind if the system is actually in New York and the clock is in California, well, we're going to have to do a negative because that's going to be a negative 3 hours at that point. But if you reverse it where the system is in California and the clock is in New York, well, of course, we then move to a positive 3. The division, for any clock that you build in the system, you do have the opportunity to assign it to a specific division. So this clock could be assigned to any one of those extra divisions. The supervisor badge, we do have 2 types of supervisor badges. One is what we call a prefix for entry, meaning that this is a supervisor badge where the supervisor could actually go in and add a punch if they needed to. Or we have one supervisor that is a badge for recall. Recall is typically a badge that starts with 10. And again, I didn't say that earlier. The supervisor badge that allows you to make a change is typically a badge that starts with 11. So again, for changes, those badges are 11. For recall, meaning employees are just able to swipe that badge and see their last punch, again, that badge is generally going to start with 10. So it might be like 10001. The default date and time, again, if you set the default date and time, that means it's just going to pick up whatever that date is when you go in to make the change. The input has 2 sides to it. It has the initial source, which I like to relabel and call it the employee source, and then it has the employee badge source by supervisor, so I like to call this the supervisor source. When that supervisor or that manager walks up to that clock, let's say to add a specific punch for an employee, how are they going to get the number in the system for that employee? Are they going to use that employee's badge, just swipe it, or a barcode badge, or are we going to allow them to key that information in, meaning they don't need the employee right next to them as they're adding this particular transaction in place? Now, from the employee side of things, well, how will the employee walk up to the clock and put in information? Are they going to have a magnetic swipe card? Are they going to have a barcode badge? Or will they be able just to walk up and key in information? Again, key is a possibility, but most cases, clients prefer the employee to have a badge, some type, either magnetic or barcode. But again, there are some clients that say, no, 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 we're not buying badges. We just want employees to walk up and pin punch in. That is indeed going to be key. The second tab over is the Configure tab. The left side here, the timeout, it's all about how much time an employee has to do something in the software. So for data input, clearly they have about a minute, 60 seconds. To enter a function, they have 20 seconds. Messages are only displayed for 2 seconds, so literally the message that says enter function is going to stay there for 2 seconds. The supervisor, when a supervisor is in as supervisor mode, their questions, because again, a little lengthy there, they're going to have 90 seconds to review their information. And the error messages that are displayed, such as invalid source or invalid badge, those messages are going to be for a little less than 2 seconds. So that's probably the message. If you ever change anything in the timeout area, that would be perhaps the only one that I would think of changing, only because people don't expect an error message for one. So I think I need to let it come across a little bit longer. So, oh, there's an error message. Because typically what will happen is they'll see the error message and then they'll try to punch in again so they can confirm what the error message is, because the error message was so fast you really had no idea what it said. Now, the messages themselves, the inner function message. So again, all of these messages, or what we call messages, invalid or invalid source. Remember, the invalid source is actually coming from one of these sources. So let's say your company actually purchased a magnetic swipe clock, but then somehow we made a mistake and sent barcode badges. Well, that's going to be a source error. As soon as that employee tries to use that particular badge and clock as that clock, it will not allow them because the source is not correct. The invalid badge, keep in mind an invalid badge is only created in the software. All badges right out of the packaging are labeled as valid. So until someone goes into the system and actually makes it an invalid badge, that is the only way that a badge becomes invalid. Invalid level actually goes back to the labor level. So you have an employee here who's trying to transfer into a different labor level. The idle message. The idle message is literally the message that is viewed at the clock along with the date and time. Most companies do like to include the company name, but it could be anything. It is up to 16 characters in a 500 or 600 or 700 series clock. Now, here's the difference when we talk about a 500 versus a 600 clock. In this version, the 500, the idle message window, because there's only one line of display, you have to choose how many seconds you're going to show the idle message and how many seconds you're going to display the date and time. Now, we'll see in version 600, the latest version of 600, it too now only has the one level of one line of display. But the earlier version, the 500 version of, version 5 of the 600 clock, it had 2 lines of display. So you didn't have this particular option to display the seconds for the idle message or display the seconds for the date of time. You didn't have that. Now, the highest swipe and go badges, remember I did tell you earlier when we were first looking at activating swipe and go, I told you swipe and go is really a 3-step process. You activated it back in the main company. You also had to turn it on as a part of the shift. And then when you built the clocks, you had to tell the clock what was the highest swipe and go badge number. Well, here's where that is being done. So again, if we know that all of the badges are going to be used as swipe and go badges, I simply recommend putting in all 9. The use of the feedback enhancer. Remember, the feedback enhancer is just a little grayish box that has a red light and it has a green light, and it sits or it resides right next to the actual clock. because in some environments it's really hard for employees to hear the sounds or to see if there was actually a successful punch or not a successful punch. Well, that's the purpose of the feedback enhancer. It is very loud, and the colors are, the green light, the red light, very, very bright. So it's great for an industrial type environment. The skip recording of the diagnostic and programming info, I never recommend for a client to do that. In other words, if we are communicating with this clock and we're sending information to be programmed, if we want to know what was sent over to be a part of the program, again, we can always go back and run that report. But here, if you skip that information, meaning you tell the system not to record that, then we have no idea. The display idle time in military format, in other words, literally on the face of the clock. We talked about this date and time right here. Well, how do you want that date and time to be listed, in AM, PM format or in military time? The TA100, the TA600, as well as the TA700 clocks, by default, always display it in AM, PM time. So if you want it in military, you do need to activate that. I point that out because the hand readers are just the reverse. The hand readers always display their time in military format by default. So if you want that to be in AM, PM format, you have to actually activate that particular feature. The transaction print transactions as they occur. Well, attached to these clocks, the 500s and the 600s, you can actually have a printer, I think it's a P17 printers. You can actually have those printers that every time an employee has a transaction, meaning an in punch or an out punch or a lunch punch, they can actually receive a receipt. And so that's what we call print transactions as they occur. Well, on that receipt, notice it says header line 1, header line 2. Well, this is actually where I can dictate what are going to be the first 2 lines of that receipt. Most companies choose to have the company name here. So you could say company name. And then sometimes they like to have whatever the company theme or slogan is in that particular window, or that second line. That is all a possibility. So whatever you want to have on those first 2 lines. Then the last item here is the bell schedule. Remember, not long ago, we were looking at the bell schedule. In fact, we created a standard bell schedule. It was a bell schedule that actually we created it to sound at 8, 12, 1, and 5 p.m. I told you there was only one bell schedule assigned to each clock. So here is where you can assign a bell schedule. You click the drop down, and you can actually make that assignment here. Any questions about the configuration of the 500 series clock? Well, if I cancel here, close here, take us back to Communication Configure over to 600, you will find the PC clock is loaded here, and it again is very, very similar. But I did tell you the 600 clock, you had a version 5 of it, and you had a version 6. The difference is, if I say 5, notice everything on this front screen is exactly the same. But if you go to Configure, you do not have an option to display the date and the idle message separately, because the version 5 clock actually had 2 lines of display. So again, it's not an option there. However, the version 6 clock, which is what we should have now, I don't believe we even have any version 5s remaining. They're all version 6 now. And they go back to separating the display into one. There's only one line of display. So again, you have to separate out how many seconds the idle message and how many seconds for the date and time. But again, it is the exact same screen. So that's why I say if you can configure a 500, you definitely can configure a 600 because the screens are exactly the same. Go ahead and close there. We'll go back to Communications Configure, and now we're headed into the 700 series. At the bottom, I'll go ahead and click Add here. We'll go ahead and make this clock 3, and it is a TA715. If you notice, the window or the screen here is primarily the same. It starts with the communication, but when we click the drop-down, you'll find some things don't actually exist. We keep the basic items. In other words, there's no converter. When we talked about the LAN, you could use a smart converter there. There's no smart converters you can use here. It is exactly how it is listed. If you're using LAN, then it's a LAN. It's a direct, Ethernet. It's definitely Ethernet, or the modem is definitely modem. You'll also notice that the baud rate for the 700 series is no longer the default of 9600, but it is the 19200. So you'll see that for the baud rate here, as well as the modem baud rate. The IP, or shall I say the ports, again, you still have the 8 ports that you get to choose from. The miscellaneous section, nothing has changed here. Again, you pick in if there's a time difference, positive versus negative. You still can assign the clock to a division. Now, the supervisor section is a little different, and that is because on these particular clocks, all of the 700 clocks, you can take any badge and make it a supervisor badge. They don't have to be just the badges that start with 11 or 10. You can take any badge and make it a supervisor badge, because now when you add a user into the system, meaning someone who is going to have access rights, when you add that particular user into the software, you're going to assign what is called a supervisor badge to them. And that is the purpose, because whenever you assign that badge, it automatically sees that badge as a supervisor badge. Now keep in mind, for someone who is going to have access to the system and you still expect that employee to punch in the system, that person will need 2 badges, because they still will need a badge to clock in and clock out, because that's going to be just their basic employee badge. But if you want them to also have supervisory rights at the clock, you'll need to issue them a supervisor badge as well. The input section to the bottom, that hasn't changed, with the exception of the barcode. Before, we didn't have to tell the system for the 500, 600 series clock. I didn't have to tell the system what type of barcode I was actually, or what type of barcode badge we were using. 3 of 9, 2 of 5, UPC code, the code 1. We didn't have to do all of that. But here, we do have to define the type of specific barcode badge, because there are different types of barcode badges. So you just have to make that distinguishing feature here. The second tab over, a little lighter than before. The timeouts, all of those are the same. The messages, with the exception of the idle message, because the 700 series does offer the 2 lines of display. The swipe and go messages, and this is what I was saying earlier. Well, not swipe and go messages, but swipe and go badges. On the 700 series clock, if I activate the clock to be a swipe and go clock, my next question says, well, do you want to turn off the function keys? Because I can make a clock swipe and go, but I can still leave the function keys available, meaning that if they have to transfer departments or they have to enter tip information, they can still do that while using the function keys. However, if I'm saying, no, the clock is strictly a swipe and go clock, and I never want them to use the function keys, I need to check the box to turn off the function keys. The skip recording of the diagnostic info, I talked about that. The display, the idle time in military, I told you earlier, the 500, 600, 700 clocks all display the time initially in AM, PM format. What's missing in that section, or in this particular section, is the whole print option. This clock, at least the 715, is not connected, or you cannot currently connect it to a printer, so we don't have the whole line 1 or receipt line 2. The bell schedule, you can still assign this particular clock to a bell schedule. So I could click the drop down here and assign it here. All right, I'll click OK here, and that's a done deal. Any questions about the 715 clock? Go back to communication, down to configure. You have the 745 clock. Now remember, this 7:45 clock, you can see it listed here. This was, I think, at one point, sales did have a package where you receive the TA100 Pro along with the TA745 clock. But again, you can tell it's built primarily the same way. So make that TA745. But it does have the opportunity to be a fingerprint clock. So if you want to make it a fingerprint clock, you can say finger. If it's just a regular swipe clock, you can keep it at none. By activating the finger part of it, you do activate the assignments tab because you will need to assign employees to a clock. You know, every hand punch unit, fingerprint unit, you do have to assign the template to the employee. The communication, none of that has changed. This entire section, it's all the same. The LAN, the Ethernet, the modem, depending on what you activate here, or if you activate Ethernet, or if you activate the modem, all same windows. The miscellaneous window, nothing has changed there. Exact same information. Supervisor section, I told you, you can now determine what is a supervisor badge. Any badge could be a supervisor badge. The source, the input here, all the same. The configure tab, there is only one new item in this area, and that is proximity offsite to remove facility code. If they're going to be using a prox badge or proximity badge, we do need to tell the system, well, to remove that facility code. Some prox badges have a 2-digit facility code or 3-digit facility code. We need to tell it what that code is so it knows not to include that when it reads the badge. Also, swipe and go, if it is going to be, in fact, this clock in itself, the TA745 clock, by default is a swipe and go clock. If you want to turn off the function keys, you have to check the box here. But by default, this clock is indeed a swipe and go clock. Notice there wasn't a question if you wanted to make it swipe and go, but the 745 clock itself is a swipe and go clock. And the assignments, well, this is where I would assign employees to this particular clock, because remember, everyone has to be assigned to a clock in order to use it, because that clock is essentially going to have a template connected to it for that employee. Here, if I want to add all of my employees to this particular clock, I just did a quick add all, but I could have added them based on divisions. If I had people that were already in the Arizona division, it would have done that, but I don't, or people in certain groups here, it would have done that as well. And the verify plus identify or identify only, I do recommend the verify plus identify because it makes it run just a little bit faster. In other words, it's going to verify the person. When that person walks up to the clock and keys in, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's going to quickly locate who is using badge number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it's going to identify that that is indeed the correct hand template, or in this case, a fingerprint template that they should be using. So it just moves it along a little bit faster. The identify mode is, well, it has nothing to verify with first, so that means it's looking, it's going through the entire database looking for that particular fingerprint, versus I'm driving it or steering it in the direction to find the fingerprint first and then identify it to make sure they're one and the same. But this one says you have to do all the work yourself. So again, it makes it just a little bit slower. So I always like to use the verify plus identify. The boxes here, auto-assign new templates to this and other clocks, or send only templates that are not already in the system. This is definitely one of the newest features in TA100 Pro, and I like to activate both of these items. In other words, anytime we are adding a new template in the clock, I want that template to automatically assign to this particular clock. Now, that is granted that the company only has the one clock, or maybe all employees have access to all clocks. Now, if that's not the case, maybe the company has 10 clocks and they have certain employees assigned to certain clocks, then no, I definitely don't want to do this. But most companies that have TA100 Pro really only have about 1 or 2 clocks that they are associating at least the hand punch units with, or the fingerprint units. So certainly I want to activate that feature. And send only templates that are not already in the clock. So anytime I send down templates, I don't want the system to have to overload itself to send templates that I already have. Just accept the templates that I don't already have in the software. Only send me those templates. So once I've uploaded the new template, then only send it out to the clocks that do not currently have that template stored. But those are the questions here. So essentially everything is exactly the same for the most part. We'll click OK here. We've added the 745. We'll go back to Communication Configure. We'll have a look at the TA777. You'll find here that everything, again, is pretty much the same. The communication information, the miscellaneous section, the supervisor, this front page is exactly the same. The configure, the only difference, and not difference because we did see it in the 745, is if it was a prox, you do have the facility code information. If you are going to set this 777 as a swipe and go, you need to activate that. And if you want to turn off the function keys, you need to activate that as well. But again, everything there for the most part is the same. Also along with that, the 7A, this is where we have the fingerprint part of it added on. So again, that's that. We'll go back to 785. The 785 also has the fingerprint. Again, fingerprint works just like it did with the 745. You'll have to assign it. So notice that screen is exactly the same because you have to assign the employees to it. But again, this clock is exactly the same, but the configuration is the same. I'm not telling you that the clocks are the same. But again, the configuration part of it is the same in how it is set up. Any questions about the configuration of our 700 series clocks? So the 715, 745, 777, 77A, 785. Perfect. Then we're headed down to our hand readers. In the hand reader section, you will find we have one clock already created here. So I'll just do an edit over that one. The description is actually the main clock. It is an active clock. For the model, remember, there are several different hand punch units that you can purchase. There's the 50, the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and 4,000. One thing you want to remember, that HP 1000, remember just like the TA745 clock was indeed a swipe and go clock only. Again, the HP 1000 is a swipe and go clock only. It doesn't have any function keys in it. So we can't have people, let's say, punching for lunch or transferring to different departments or jobs. You can't do that from an HP 1000 clock. In this case, I'll go ahead and make this a HP 3000. The idle prompt, again, the same way we had an idle message that we could assign to all of the other clocks, we do have that idle message that we can assign here as well. The only difference is the idle messages in the other clocks, the 500, 600, 700, the idle message was 16 characters. With the hand punch unit, the idle message is only 14 characters. So you will definitely need to make sure that the idle message is no more than 14 characters. The communication, this window is a little tighter than the other clocks, but here's where we're deciding if it's RS-485 or serial, or it can be a modem clock. Notice if I click modem, it does open up the modem phone number window, or if I click Ethernet, it opens up the IP address. The IP port, the hand punch unit always uses 3001. That never changes. The time difference, again, same time difference question. It could be positive or it could be negative. The division, here's where you can assign a clock to a specific division. The assignments tab, because again, we are talking about assignments. It works just like the fingerprint. We have to assign employees to the clock. So here, if I assign all of my employees, again, you'll notice they're all automatically assigned. But notice the column that says template. They currently do not have a template on file. So literally, I still need to enroll those employees at the clock to retrieve those templates. Yes, I've assigned those employees, but without a template, they still are unable to punch at the clock. Also, we have the auto-assign new templates to this and other clocks. So again, I can do that automatically as soon as I have the templates in the system. And that's given that all employees can be associated with all of the clocks. The miscellaneous tab. Here, the first question is where we can download the bill schedule. Notice I have that option here. The miscellaneous window. This starts with the site. I've never had an opportunity or needed to change the site ID, so it's always stayed at 1 in anything that I have done. The access duration, how long am I giving the employee at the clock? They have 10 seconds. How many tries can they do this at the clock? In other words, how many times can they put their hand in and the system try to read it? That is going to be a total of 6. The reject threshold. It is set at 125. A reject threshold is simply where we're telling the system, in other words, when this employee enrolls in the clock took a picture of their hand at that time. Now, every time they try to go and clock in at that particular clock, the system is basically going to grade them on how close they are to that original enrollment template that they created. The lower the number, the closer they are to that original enrollment template. The higher the number, it literally means that something is changing about that employee's hand. It could be maybe their hand is a little swollen today. It could be maybe they have arthritis. Maybe they have a sweater that's covering partial of the hand. Maybe they're wearing a ring. But something is different. And that reject threshold will not allow it to go beyond 125. So if it goes beyond that, that means they need to go ahead and clean it up. So a high number is never a good number. The keypad beep, we can have the system beep as an employee enters or pushes the numbers. The 12-hour display, this is what I was saying earlier. By default, the hand punch unit does see everything in military time. If you want it to be displayed in AM PM format, this is definitely where you'll have to activate the 12-hour display. The no menu versus a punch menu, pretty much this is the same as what we call swipe and go mode. So no menu equals swipe and go. Punch menu equals no swipe and go. The passwords that you see to the right side, all hand punch units come with the same set of passwords. And these are true default passwords. So if you need to get into service the clock for some reason, then you're going to use the password of 1. Now, you can change that. Let's say you want to change that for your client. You can certainly come here in the software and change those passwords. But do know this, if there's ever a problem with that clock and that clock has to be rebooted or reset, do know it goes back to those basic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 passwords. Enrollment. So for someone to be able to enroll new employees into the system, they are going to be using password 4, unless, of course, you guys change it. Now, for someone to get in management mode to maybe add a punch to an employee, that's going to be 3. And the special enrollments go back to, well, maybe we need to enroll someone that doesn't have a thumb, so we need to do a special enrollment. Again, that you'll need a little higher access, so that's going to be number 5. And keep in mind, the higher the access, you have everything below you. So if you are access level 3, then that means you have 1, 2, and 3. Or if you're access 5, you have everything below you, 1 through 5. The function keys. In this particular clock, it was a HP 3000. So the HP 3000 does come with 2 function keys. The function keys are listed here. You can decide if you want to take function 1 and make it the department, or function 2 and make it the job. Again, that is the option that you have here because it does come with the 2 function keys. At the bottom, well, let me assign the bell schedule there. Assign the bell schedule here. We'll click OK. And that clock has been created. So again, all of the clocks, although the hand reader, the information is not in the same place that it was for the 500, the 600, and the 700 clocks, essentially it's all the same information for all of the clocks that you're adding into the software. Questions, comments, or concerns about any of the clock configurations that we have covered? All right. Well, once you have all of those clocks in the software, it then means that you'll need to find a way to communicate with those clocks. So you have the clocks up, the clocks are on the wall, employees have started clocking in and clocking out. How do you retrieve the information from those particular clocks? Well, that is what we call the polling process. So here I'll come down to poll, communications, poll. Notice here there are 2 tabs. The first tab is where you're deciding which clock you're going to poll or communicate with. Here, if I want to communicate with all of them, I can. Or if I don't want to communicate with them, I do not have to. And someone's asking the question about the HP 4000. Again, the HP 4000 clock follows the same configuration as all of the others. Remember, in this window, you're just deciding to make it an HP 3000 clock. But again, the setup is exactly the same. The HP 4000 clock is the clock that does give you the option to have a badge as well, though. So if you're talking clock information itself, that's outside of the configuration. And back to communication poll. Here, if we decided to poll all of the clocks, the polling options tab is where you're deciding when we open the lines of communication, exactly what are we going to communicate about? Because think about it. When we decide to poll or communicate, that's what we're doing. We're opening the lines of communication. If we did not have anything in this window activated, well, that would defeat the whole purpose. Because now I'm opening the lines of communication, but I am not communicating about anything. It's kind of like me picking up the phone to call someone long distance, and we just hold the phone. Well, we've opened the lines of communication, and we're paying for this communication, but no one is saying anything. So same rules apply here. This is where we tell the system what we either want to send or what we want to receive. The first option here, the poll transactions, we definitely want to poll the transactions, meaning any punches in that clock, in punches, out punches, I want to have those punches brought back over into the system. The clear clock transactions, I always recommend that you clear the clock transactions because remember, that clock only has so much memory. So if you keep polling and never clearing, all of those punches are still being housed in that specific clock. So you do need to clear the clock transactions. The set clock date and time, anytime you poll a clock, you do have the opportunity to set the date and time. Now, should you set the date and time all the time? Well, you have to realize if it's necessary. If a client or an employee has called about the clock and they said the time is off, then definitely the next time that you communicate, you may want to set the date and time. But if not, it's not something you have to do all the time. The programming of the clock, I do recommend to program the clock because if there have been changes that you have done in the clock, maybe you've changed the idle message in the clock, maybe you've updated the swipe and go badge information, any of that has changed, you definitely want that information to be loaded. The bell schedules, again, if we have bell schedules included, we definitely want to make sure those are loaded into the clock at least the first time around. Now, if there have been changes to the bell schedules, then definitely you want to always load the bell schedule information again as well. The messages. Well, messages, we haven't actually seen the messaging section. We'll see that tomorrow because that's an employee personal message. meaning this is where I have the opportunity to assign a personal message to an employee, such as happy birthday, or just even as their name. And I typically recommend it to be their name because it almost serves as a confirmation. But those are, again, personal messages. Now keep in mind, certain clocks do personal messages. All of your 500, your 600, the PC clock, the 700 series clock, but not your hand punch units. HP 50, 1000, 2000, 3000, they do not do messages. On the other hand, the HP 4000 does indeed do messaging. So you can get messaging from that clock. But then that is a fancier clock. It does the badges, it does messaging, it does all of that. Now, however, that particular clock is a little light on memory because you're using so much of the memory to do all of those special things. The hand reader section itself, this is a very important section. We can retrieve templates. So when we have those clocks, those hand readers, those fingerprint reader clocks, if we have enrolled employees at those clocks, we do need to retrieve the templates. And we can do that in this particular section. But notice when you retrieve the templates, you also close off the send and clear templates, which makes sense. We can only do one thing at a time. So either doing this polling process, we're going to retrieve. Another polling process, I can certainly send the templates down. The last item, or if I uncheck this, you'll notice I can do a send. Now the clear, I do say stay away from clearing the templates because remember what happens. If you clear the templates at a clock, meaning this clock no longer has any record of any employees that's supposed to use it, that means none of the employees will be able to clock in or out at that particular clock. But no worries. If you do make a mistake and you clear the templates, you can always go back and send the templates. But the goal is you have to make sure that you have retrieved the templates and the templates are resting in TA100 Pro. For example, a lot of clients that only have one clock, they will just think, well, because we enrolled the person at that clock, the template is already there. We don't necessarily need to retrieve the templates and keep them in TA100 Pro. But two examples. What if you get another clock, or maybe you get two new clocks? Because you don't have those templates enrolled in TA100 Pro, you're going to make everybody go and enroll at the other two new clocks? Well, that's not good. Again, if you had those templates in TA100 Pro, we could just send those templates out to the new clocks. Or the second example, what if something happened to the clock itself and you needed to get a new clock? Well, now you definitely have to enroll everyone all over again because you didn't have the opportunity to retrieve the templates and allow them to be resting in TA100 Pro. So then when you did get the new clock, you could just send the templates right to that clock. The process punches after polling, I do recommend anytime you poll the clocks, you definitely want to process the punches. Think of processing as I'm going through, I'm making sure I have all the latest and greatest information, and I'm making sure that I share with you everything that I have. It's literally putting those punches where they need to go. In the time card, I'm processing it to make sure that I don't have any duplicate punches, any opposing punches. I'm processing it to make sure, oh, did that first change punch accrue back to the previous in punch? That's what we call processing. Based on all of those rules that we set up as a part of your policy, all of those things are happening behind the scenes for you so that when you look at it in the time card, you're looking at true processed information. At the bottom, if I were indeed going to poll this clock or all of these clocks, I would simply go ahead and click poll. Right now, though, I do not have any of those clocks connected directly to my computer, so I'm unable to show you the actual polling. But the polling is just a graphic that literally comes up. One side has a computer, the other side has a clock, and you can actually see the information as it is sending it across from one to the other. And then, of course, the direction actually changes. So it normally goes from the clock to the computer. You can see that because it's polling the information. So it's sending all of that information into the computer. And then when it's all done with that part of it, then you can see it changes, and you can see the information going from the computer into the actual clock graphic. So again, it's a very true graphic to form because it's an animation type graphic, so you can actually see the information going through. But what's most important, I always like to show clients when we do a polling, is if we did load the names or messages to the clock, you can actually see, if you look, it runs very fast, but you can actually see those names being uploaded to the clock during the polling process. So I always think that's good for them to see information going across. Any questions about what you should activate as a part of the polling process? All right, then folks, that is actually all that we have time for. We do have one outstanding item, and that is the auto process. So tomorrow I will actually start with the auto process in part 2. And then we'll be back on schedule after we do the auto process. Questions, comments, or concerns about anything that we have discussed in our training today? All right. Well, folks, it has certainly been a pleasure. I will hear you all tomorrow on Wednesday, November 17th. Same location. I think all of you have the go-to meeting for part 2. Do know it is a separate or a different go-to meeting. So if you did not receive that email, just communicate with your reseller rep or tell me that now. We'll make sure that we get that out to you. Part 1 uses it's a completely separate go-to meeting. You'll even notice that the access code, the dial-in number, all of that is completely different from part 2. So we just want to make sure everybody has part 2 and you're ready to go for tomorrow. All right. Well, folks, it's been a pleasure. I'll hear you all tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye-bye.